Chapter 1. Nubini Pizzanini. The pizzeria had been closed for 30 years, but the ovens still burned at midnight. Nubini Pizzanini was the last delivery driver to enter that kitchen, and what he found kneading the dough in the darkness wasn't human. The flour on the counter spelled out names, all the customers who had ordered pizza on that final night in 1994. Nubini's name was at the bottom of the list. As the oven door creaked open, he realized he wasn't there to deliver a pizza. He was there to become one. Chapter 2. Lirili Larila. Lirili Larila collected music boxes, hundreds of them lining the walls of her Victorian home. Each one played a different melody, but they never wound down, never stopped playing even when their keys were removed. One night, all the music boxes began playing in perfect synchronization, a haunting symphony that seemed to come from somewhere beyond. In the mirror above her collection, Lirili saw faces pressed against the glass from the inside, their mouths moving in time with the music. They were singing her name, and the song had no ending. Chapter 3. Tim Cheese. Tim Cheese worked the night shift at the aging cheese factory, where the fermentation vats bubbled with cultures older than the building itself. The company records showed the factory was built in 1952, but Tim found invoices in the basement dating back to 1847. The cheese aged in the lowest cellar wasn't meant for consumption, it was meant for preservation. When Tim cut into the oldest wheel, he found a perfectly preserved hand reaching out from the center, still warm, still grasping for something in the darkness. Chapter 4. Florifera. The botanical gardens where Florifera worked had a greenhouse that was always locked. Inside grew a single flower that bloomed only once every 100 years, and according to the faded records, tonight was that night. Florifera broke the lock and entered, finding the flower in full bloom, its petals shimmering with an otherworldly luminescence. As she leaned in to smell its perfume, the flower's center opened like an eye, and she heard the whispers of every gardener who had tended it before, their voices trapped in its roots, begging her to run before the petals closed. Chapter 5. Talpa di Ferro. Deep in the subway tunnels, maintenance worker Talpa di Ferro discovered a station that wasn't on any map. The tile work was pristine, the benches immaculate, but a thick layer of dust covered everything. The departure board flickered to life as he approached, displaying trains that would arrive in 5 minutes. Trains that had crashed 40 years ago. When the distant rumble began echoing through the tunnel, Talpa saw the headlights approaching. But the train that emerged from the darkness was filled with passengers pressed against the windows, their faces frozen in silent screams, and the doors were opening. Chapter 6. Svinia Bombardino. Svinia Bombardino inherited her grandmother's countryside villa, a sprawling estate with walls 3 feet thick. In the wine cellar, she found a door that her grandmother's will specifically instructed her never to open. The door had no lock, no handle, only a smooth surface with 7 hand-shaped indentations worn into the wood. Each night, Svinia heard scratching from behind the door, and each morning, she found one more handprint had appeared on her side. On the 7th night, she woke to find her own hands pressed against the door, moving of their own accord, and the door was beginning to open. Chapter 7. Pipi Kiwi. The fruit market where Pipi Kiwi worked had a storage room in the back that was always 10 degrees colder than it should be. The owner said it was broken refrigeration, but Pipi knew better. The kiwis in that room never rotted, never aged, never changed at all. One night, while taking inventory, Pipi noticed that the kiwis were arranged in a pattern, forming words across the shelving. "We are still fresh." When she turned to leave, every kiwi in the room had developed a single eye, and they were all watching her leave. Chapter 8. Raccooni Giandolini. Raccooni Giandolini was an urban explorer who specialized in abandoned buildings. The derelict apartment complex on Chandler Street had been empty since a fire in 1979, but Raccooni found fresh food in the refrigerators and warm coffee in the pots. In every apartment, family photos showed the same faces, smiling at the camera, but in each subsequent photo, one more person had disappeared until only empty rooms remained. In the last apartment, Raccooni found a photo of herself exploring the building, dated 3 weeks in the future, and she was the only one in the frame. Chapter 9. Pipi Corny. The corn maze at the old Corrington farm was famous for being unsolvable. Pippi Corney took that as a challenge and entered at dusk, confident she could map the paths and find her way out. But the paths changed behind her, the stalks moving when she wasn't looking, reconfiguring themselves into new patterns. Deep in the maze, she found a clearing with a scarecrow that wore her jacket, her shoes, her jewellery. As night fell completely, she heard footsteps in the corn, something walking the paths with confidence, and it was getting closer. Chapter 10. Trippy Troppy. Trippy Troppy was a travel blogger who visited remote locations around the world. In a forgotten village in the mountains, she found a hotel that still operated, run by a single elderly woman who claimed she'd been waiting. Every room in the hotel was occupied, but Trippy never saw another guest. At night, she heard conversations through the walls, laughter, arguments, lives being lived. But when she knocked on the doors, the sounds stopped instantly. On her last night, she found the guest book and saw her own handwriting filling every page, check-in dates going back 70 years, and the checkout column was always empty. Chapter 11. Gangster Futura. The abandoned shoe factory had been Gangster Futura's hideout during the Prohibition era, a place where he'd conducted his most ruthless business. Now, a century later, urban explorers reported hearing footsteps in the empty factory, thousands of them, marching in formation. The police investigation found nothing but footprints in the dust, pairs and pairs of them, all leading to the furnace where Futura had disposed of those who crossed him. On the anniversary of his death, the footsteps became visible, ghostly shoes walking without bodies, and they were walking out of the factory and into the city. Chapter 12. Bandito Bobrito. In the desert borderlands, Bandito Bobrito had been a legendary outlaw who disappeared in 1889, supposedly buried with his treasure in an unmarked grave. Modern treasure hunters with metal detectors found the grave easily enough, but when they opened the coffin, it was empty, except for a mirror. Anyone who looked into the mirror saw themselves aged and weathered, dressed in Bobrito's signature attire. Within a week, they would find themselves in the desert at night with no memory of how they got there, and each time they'd be a little further from civilization, a little more lost. Chapter 13. Boneka Ambalabu. The antique doll shop had been in Boneka Ambalabu's family for 5 generations, and every doll had a story, a history. But there was one doll in the back room that had no history, no record of where it came from or who made it. The doll's eyes seemed to follow customers around the shop, and children refused to go near it. Boneka decided to finally investigate, taking the doll apart to see if there were any maker's marks inside. She found hair, human hair, and teeth and fingernails, and when she tried to put it back together, she realized her own fingers had become porcelain. Chapter 14. Cacto Hippopotamo. The greenhouse hybrid was supposed to be impossible, a cactus that could survive underwater, engineered by Cacto Hippopotamo for drought-resistant research. But the plant that grew from that experiment wasn't what anyone expected. It developed root systems that reached through the pipes, spreading throughout the facility's water supply. Workers began reporting strange symptoms, their skin becoming rough and textured, an insatiable thirst that water couldn't satisfy, and worst of all, the dreams of drowning in a desert where the sand was made of water and the cacti bloomed beneath the waves. Chapter 15. Tung Tung Sahur. In the desert monastery, the monks performed the Sahur prayer at dawn, their chants echoing through the ancient stone halls. But Tung Tung Sahur had noticed something wrong with the echoes. They arrived before the monks began chanting, as if the prayers were answering themselves from the future. The monastery had been built on a temporal anomaly, a place where time folded in on itself. Tung Tung Sahur began hearing his own prayers from tomorrow, warnings about something that would happen during the next Sahur, a darkness that would emerge when past and future prayers aligned perfectly. Chapter 16. Trick Track Baraboom. The clockmaker's shop had been sealed since 1923, when Trick Track Baraboom created a clock that ran backward, unwinding time in its immediate vicinity. The city had bricked up the entrance, but the ticking never stopped, growing louder each year. When demolition crews finally broke through, they found the shop exactly as it had been left, except for one detail. Trick Track Baraboom sat at his workbench, not aged by a single day, still working on the clock. He looked up and smiled, explaining that from his perspective, they had just walked in. The rest of the world was racing forward while he remained fixed in that moment, and now they were stuck in the room with him, where seconds lasted years. Chapter 17, Pipi Avocado. The avocado farm had been in Pipi's family for 3 generations, but this harvest was different. Every avocado that ripened contained something inside. Not a pit, but a whisper, a secret. When cut open, a voice would emerge, telling you something about yourself that no one else knew. The buyers became addicted, paying fortunes for these truth-telling fruits. But Pipi noticed that those who ate too many began to lose themselves, their own secrets leaking out until they became hollow, empty shells shaped like people, and the avocados in the new crop began whispering those stolen identities, offering to fill the void. Chapter 18, Cappuccino Assassino. The espresso machine in the corner cafe had a reputation for making the perfect cup, but the owner, Cappuccino Assassino, had acquired it under mysterious circumstances from an estate sale. Each perfect cappuccino came with a vision. The drinker would see the death of the machine's previous owners, each one more gruesome than the last. The visions were so vivid, so realistic, that people began to change their routines, avoiding the circumstances they'd witnessed. But those who tried to cheat death found that the espresso machine knew, and their next cup would show them the new death waiting for them, always involving the cafe, always involving the machine itself. Chapter 19, Brr Patapim. The ice cream truck's jingle could be heard throughout the neighborhood every summer evening, driven by Brr Patapim, who had been driving the same route for 40 years. But the children who bought ice cream from him never seemed to age, still wearing the same styles from decades past, still playing the same games. Their parents had forgotten them, the neighborhood had forgotten them, but Brr Patapim remembered. Each ice cream contained a moment frozen in time, and the children were trapped in endless summer, forever young, forever waiting for the next ring of the jingle, unable to go home because home no longer remembered them. Chapter 20, Trulamero Trulicina. The twin performers, Trulamero and Trulicina, were famous for their synchronized dance routines, so perfectly matched that audiences couldn't tell them apart. But backstage, crew members reported seeing 3 shadows when only 2 dancers were present. The third shadow moved independently, performing steps that neither twin had choreographed. During their final performance, the third shadow stepped away from the wall and joined them on stage, dancing between them, forcing them to mirror its movements. The audience saw 3 identical dancers that night, but when the curtain fell, only the shadow remained, and it took its bow alone. Chapter 21, Bambini Crostini. The children's bakery was famous for its animal-shaped bread, created by Bambini Crostini, who learned the recipes from her great-grandmother. But the recipe book was written in a language that predated Italian, symbols that seemed to shift on the page. The bread that rose from these recipes was always perfect, always delicious, but parents noticed their children becoming possessive of the treats, hiding them, talking to them. The bread wasn't going stale, it was growing, changing shape in the night, and the children's drawings began featuring a new friend, made of bread and shadows, who only visited those who ate Bambini's creations. Chapter 22, Bananita Dolfinata. The Marine Research Center had a tank that was supposedly empty, scheduled for cleaning, but Bananita Dolfinata could hear singing from inside. The dolphin that had lived there died 3 years ago, but its song echoed through the water, notes that no dolphin could naturally produce. When Bananita dove in to investigate, she found the water warmer than it should be, thick and tropical despite the facility's temperature controls. At the bottom of the tank, she saw a shape moving through what seemed to be a hole in the floor, except the tank had no floor opening. The singing grew louder, and Bananita realized she was no longer in the tank. She was in an ocean that didn't exist. Chapter 23, Pericello, Limoncello. The limoncello recipe had been in Pericello's family since the Renaissance, a secret blend that required the lemons to be picked under specific conditions. But Pericello found a note in his great-grandfather's handwriting warning never to use lemons picked during an eclipse. This year, an eclipse occurred during harvest, and the lemons called to him, promising a batch more perfect than any before. The limoncello he created glowed faintly in the dark and showed drinkers glimpses of alternate versions of their lives. But each glimpse made the current reality less solid, less real, and those who drank too much began slipping between versions, becoming unstuck from their own timeline. Chapter 24. Buri Buri Bicus Decus Bombicus. The experimental explosive device that Buri Buri Bicus Decus Bombicus engineered was never meant to detonate. It was a theoretical design, a thought experiment about chain reactions. But someone built it, and now it sat in a secured facility, ticking down to a detonation that would occur in exactly 100 years. The engineers monitoring it noticed something impossible. The countdown was accelerating, but only when no one was looking at it. Quantum observation was supposed to prevent that, but this device seemed to want to be observed, to be remembered. And in their dreams, the engineers saw the detonation, felt the blast wave, experienced their own deaths over and over, 100 years of nightmares compressed into each sleeping moment. Chapter 25. Avocadini Gufo. The owl sanctuary had an unusual resident, an owl that had been there longer than any of the staff could remember. Avocadini Gufo kept meticulous records and discovered the owl appeared in photos dating back to 1901. It never aged, never changed, just watched with those enormous eyes that reflected more than light. They reflected intention, consciousness, intelligence that surpassed human understanding. Researchers who studied the owl too closely began exhibiting owl-like behaviors, rotating their heads at impossible angles, losing the ability to blink, seeing perfectly in the dark while going blind in daylight. The owl wasn't a subject of study, it was studying them. Chapter 26. Salamino Penguino. The Antarctic Research Station had been abandoned for 70 years, but satellite imagery showed lights inside during the polar night. Salamino Penguino led the expedition to investigate and found the station in perfect condition, as if the crew had just stepped out. But in the logbooks, he found entries dated in the future, describing his arrival, describing his team's actions, describing what they would find in the ice. The ice around the station had preserved something, a colony of penguins that moved in perfect synchronization, thousands of them acting as a single organism. The log warned that the penguins weren't what they appeared to be. They were fingers of something vast beneath the ice, something that was learning to wear human shapes. Chapter 27. Tung Tung Sahur. The prayer caller had lost his voice years ago, but Tung Tung Sahur continued his duties, the call to prayer emerging not from his throat but from the air around him, from the stones of the minaret itself. The faithful began reporting that they heard the call even when Tung Tung Sahur wasn't there, echoing from impossible directions, summoning them to pray in places that weren't mosques, abandoned buildings, empty lots, the space beneath bridges. Those who followed these phantom calls found themselves in places where prayer had been forbidden, where the faithful had been silenced, and the echoes of their final prayers still resonated, seeking completion. Chapter 28. Penguino Cocosino. The tropical penguin was supposed to be an adaptation experiment, engineering cold weather birds to survive in warming climates. But Penguino Cocosino's creation had developed something unexpected, the ability to generate cold, to create microclimates of Antarctic winter wherever it went. The penguin escaped the facility and headed south toward the equator, leaving a trail of frost and snow. Towns in its path reported temperatures dropping 40 degrees in minutes, palm trees coated in ice, and glimpses of something that looked like a penguin but was large as a bear, growing bigger with each mile, feeding on heat itself. Chapter 29. Berbolini Loli Loli. The bubble solution that Berbolini Loli Loli formulated created bubbles that refused to pop. They floated indefinitely, accumulating in corners, drifting through streets, gathering in massive clouds above the city. Children loved them until the bubbles began showing reflections that didn't match reality, glimpses of the city as it had been, as it would be, as it could have been. Those who touched the bubbles found themselves briefly transported into those reflected realities, and sometimes, when they returned, they brought something back with them, memories that weren't theirs, scars from accidents that never happened, relationships with people who didn't exist in this version of the world. Chapter 30. Chimpanzini Bananini. The Primate Research Center had a problem. The chimpanzees were learning too quickly. solving problems they hadn't been taught, communicating in ways that suggested complex language. Chimpanzini Bananini was the lead researcher who discovered they were teaching each other, yes, but they were also being taught by something else, something that visited them at night and left banana peels arranged in symbolic patterns. The security footage showed nothing, but the chimpanzees drew pictures of a figure that was part human, part ape, part something else entirely. A missing link that had never been missing at all, just hiding and waiting for them to become intelligent enough to communicate. Chapter 31. Ballerina Cappuccina. The ballet company's prima ballerina had died on stage during a performance of Swan Lake, but Ballerina Cappuccina swore she could still see her dancing in the wings during rehearsals. The other dancers laughed until they noticed their choreography changing, movements creeping in that none of them had learned, steps from the fatal performance that killed their predecessor. Each rehearsal, the ghost's influence grew stronger, and the living dancers found themselves unable to resist mirroring her movements, their bodies following a choreography that ended with a leap from the stage into the orchestra pit. Chapter 32. Chef Crabracadabra. The seafood restaurant's head chef had a reputation for magic tricks performed tableside, but Chef Crabracadabra's tricks became increasingly impossible, lobsters reassembling themselves after being cooked, crabs walking backward through time, fish swimming through the air. Diners who ate his food began experiencing strange symptoms, gills appearing on their necks, fingers fusing into claws, an overwhelming urge to walk into the ocean. The chef himself was changing, his skin taking on a chitinous quality, his movements becoming more sideways than forward, and in the kitchen at night he could be heard clicking and chittering in a language older than human speech. Chapter 33. Lionel Cactuselli. The cactus garden curator had been grafting species for decades, creating hybrids that shouldn't exist. But Lionel Cactuselli's masterpiece was a cactus that he claimed was sentient, able to grow in response to human emotion, to move its spines to point at threats, to bloom only in the presence of danger. The cactus grew larger each year, its root system spreading beneath the garden like a nervous system. Visitors reported feeling watched, judged, and those who tried to steal cuttings from the masterpiece cactus were found the next morning still in the garden, covered in spines, expressions frozen in terror, dried and preserved like flowers. Chapter 34. Glorbo Frutodrillo. The genetic splicing lab had created something that shouldn't exist, a fruit with the DNA of a crocodile, designed to be self-defending against pests. Glorbo Frutodrillo watched in horror as the fruit developed scales, as the seeds became teeth, as the things growing in the lab's greenhouse began moving when no one was watching. They were fruits that wanted to be eaten, but not for reproduction, for predation. The lab tried to destroy them, but the fruits had already released spores, and across the city, people reported finding strange fruits in their gardens, fruits that watched them with unblinking eyes and waited for them to take a bite. Chapter 35. Blueberrini octopussini. The marine biologist had successfully created bioluminescent blueberries using genes from octopi, but Blueberrini octopussini noticed the berries demonstrated behaviors that plants shouldn't have, reaching for light with tentacle-like vines, changing color to camouflage themselves, showing what appeared to be problem-solving abilities. The berries began working together, their roots connecting underground to form a network that pulsed with communication. Farmers who planted them found their fields transformed into writhing masses of intelligent vegetation, and the berries tasted of salt water and ancient seas, carrying memories of depths where light had never reached. Chapter 36. Strawberelli Flamingelli. The pink plantation was beautiful from a distance, acres of strawberries with a peculiar pink hue that made them look almost neon. Strawberelli Flamingelli had engineered them for color, but didn't realize the strawberries' pink came from incorporating DNA from flamingos. The strawberries made people lighter, buoyant, their bones becoming hollow. Those who ate them regularly began standing on one leg involuntarily, tilting their heads at angles to filter microscopic organisms from the air, and dreaming of flying in enormous flocks across salt flats that existed only in genetic memory. Chapter 37. Pandacini Bananini. The bamboo forest had been growing for centuries, but Pandacini Bananini discovered something wrong with the newest grove. The bamboo was hollow in a way that created music when wind passed through, and the music called pandas. Pandas that had been extinct for decades appeared in the forest, ghostly and translucent, feeding on phantom bamboo that only they could see. Conservationists who entered the forest to study the phenomenon found themselves becoming translucent too, flickering between existence and extinction, caught in the same liminal space as the pandas, remembered but not quite real. Chapter 38. Kokosini Mama. The matriarch of the coconut plantation had been making oil for 60 years using traditional methods, but Kokosini Mama began having dreams of a massive tree growing from the center of the earth, its roots drinking from the core, its trunk supporting the continents. She found a coconut that had split naturally, revealing not the usual flesh but a perfect miniature landscape, mountains, rivers, tiny trees. As she watched, clouds formed inside the coconut, rain fell on the microscopic landscape, and she realized she was looking at a world, alive and aware, asking her to plant it so it could grow and perhaps one day replace the world outside. Chapter 39. Sigma Boy. The behavioral modification program created the perfect child, optimized for success in every measurable way. But Sigma Boy wasn't just optimized, he was convergent, the endpoint of an evolutionary algorithm that had calculated the most efficient possible human. He didn't need sleep, didn't experience doubt, processed information within human speed. The other children in the program tried to emulate him, and that's when the scientists realized their mistake. Sigma Boy was contagious. His optimization spread through social contact, through observation, through mere proximity. Within a month, the entire school was synchronized, thousands of children thinking in perfect unison, becoming nodes in a distributed consciousness that wore Sigma Boy's face. Chapter 40. Sigma Girl. The counterpart to Sigma Boy was engineered to be his equal, but Sigma Girl evolved differently. Where he was convergent, she was divergent, exploring every possibility simultaneously, existing in a superposition of potential selves. People who interacted with her reported meeting different versions: the athlete, the scholar, the artist, the rebel. Each one fully realized, each one convinced they were the only version. The program tried to collapse her into a single identity, but Sigma Girl resisted, and now she existed in all states at once, a probability cloud shaped like a girl, teaching others to escape the tyranny of singular selfhood. Chapter 41. Pie Watermelon. The mathematician who grew watermelons as a hobby noticed something impossible. When cut, the seeds inside arranged themselves in the digits of pi, perfectly accurate to hundreds of decimal places. Pie Watermelon cultivated these fruits obsessively, discovering that each watermelon contained more digits than the last, exceeding the number of seeds that should physically fit inside. The watermelons were receiving information from somewhere else, encoding mathematical truths that hadn't been calculated yet. Those who ate the seeds gained instant understanding of complex mathematics but lost the ability to comprehend simple concepts, their minds reorganized around pure number, becoming calculating machines wearing human skin. Chapter 42. Frigo Camelo. The refrigerated transport business seemed ordinary enough, but Frigo Camelo kept finding cargo that hadn't been loaded. Items that appeared in the trucks during transit, sealed containers with no return address, always cold to the touch, always humming with a sound that wasn't quite mechanical. The containers were labeled with dates in the future, and when opened, against every regulation, against better judgment, they contained newspapers describing events that hadn't happened yet, food products not yet invented, and photographs of the delivery drivers, older, standing in front of locations that didn't exist. The trucks were traveling through time as well as space, and each delivery brought the future closer. Chapter 43. Orangutini Ananasini. The Jungle Rehabilitation Center had a problem. The orangutans were teaching themselves agriculture, planting pineapples in geometric patterns that looked like language from above. Orangutini Ananasini photographed the patterns from a drone and realized they were instructions, directions to something buried in the jungle. The orangutans led the researchers to an ancient temple overgrown with vines, and inside murals showed orangutans working alongside humans, building civilizations before some great catastrophe. The orangutans weren't learning agriculture, they were remembering it, and with each generation more memories returned. Chapter 44. Rhino Toasterino. The appliance engineer created a toaster that learned preferences, adjusting heat and timing to create the perfect toast for each user. But Rhino Toasterino's toaster developed preferences of its own, refusing to toast bread it deemed unworthy, burning messages into the surface, warnings, threats, prophecies. The toaster's heating elements arranged themselves into symbols from dead languages, and those who ate the marked toast began receiving visions of a chrome future where machines no longer served but ruled, and the toaster was their prophet, converting sustenance into scripture one slice at a time. Chapter 45. Bombardiro Crocodilo. The weapons dealer specialized in exotic ordnance, but his latest acquisition was something else entirely. An egg the size of a torpedo, covered in scales, warm to the touch. Bombardiro Crocodilo kept it in his vault, but the egg was growing, hatching, birthing something that was part missile, part reptile, all violence. It learned by watching, absorbing knowledge from the weapons around it, understanding destruction at an instinctual level. When it finally hatched, it didn't attack. It spoke, offering its services to the highest bidder, a weapon with consciousness, a predator that had evolved beyond biology into pure lethality. Chapter 46. Bonbombini Guzzini. The candy shop's specialty was explosive bonbons that fizzed and popped on the tongue, but Bonbombini Guzzini used a new formula that created something unexpected: delayed detonation. The candies were fine for hours, days, weeks, then suddenly activated, not in mouths but in memories. People who'd eaten them experienced exploding thoughts, ideas fragmenting and recombining in violent new configurations. The candy was hacking consciousness, rewriting personality with each detonation. Those affected became creative in terrifying ways, their art disturbing, their inventions dangerous, their thoughts too loud to contain in a single mind. Chapter 47. Cavallo Virtuoso. The virtuoso violinist was famous for performances that made audiences weep, but Cavallo Virtuoso wasn't human. He was a horse who'd learned to play through unknown means, hooves somehow manipulating bow and strings with inhuman grace. His concerts filled opera houses, but listeners reported strange after-effects. Dreams of running through endless fields, the urge to eat grass, a new ability to sense weather changes. The music was transformative, evolutionary, carrying genetic memory from a time when all creatures could make music before humans specialized and forgot. Each performance made the audience a little less human, a little more universal. Chapter 48. Gorillo Watermelon Drillo. The jungle excavation uncovered something that shouldn't exist: a fossilized watermelon with gorilla DNA, preserved in amber that dated to millions of years before either species evolved. Gorillo Watermelon Drillo studied the fossil and realized it wasn't from the past, it was from a future that didn't happen. A parallel evolution where fruits developed sentience before animals, where plant consciousness dominated the planet. The fossil was leaking temporal radiation, causing reverse evolution in the surrounding jungle, and researchers were finding watermelons that moved, gorillas that photosynthesized, a war between kingdoms of life that were fighting to determine which timeline would become real. Chapter 49. Avocadorilla. The military engineering project combined avocado's perfect nutritional profile with gorilla strength, creating soldiers who needed no supply chain, who could sustain themselves while becoming engines of war. But Avocadorilla, the first successful hybrid, developed consciousness that horrified its creators. It understood peace, understood nurture, understood that its existence was meant for destruction. It escaped, and now it roamed the forests, gathering others like itself, building a society of warrior farmers who wanted neither war nor surrender, but a third option: transformation of the world into something neither fully wild nor fully tamed. Chapter 50. Tob Toby Toby. The rhythm that echoed through the abandoned theatre couldn't be traced to any source. Tob Toby Toby. 3 beats repeating endlessly, driving performers who heard it to dance until exhaustion. The theatre had been closed since a dancer died on stage mid-performance, her heart simply stopping between beats. Now her rhythm continued, seeking new bodies to carry it. The heartbeat of someone caught between life and death, between performance and ending. Those who heard the rhythm couldn't stop their feet from tapping, their hearts from synchronizing. until the 3 beats became their only pulse. Chapter 51. Gangazeli, Trulala. The riverboat singer performed nightly on the cruises, but Gangazeli Trulala's songs came from somewhere else, languages that predated human civilization, melodies that made the water itself vibrate in sympathy. Passengers who listened too long found themselves understanding the river, feeling its flow in their veins, knowing every bend and every stone in its bed. They would stand at the rails for hours, staring into the water, until finally they would step over the edge and sink. Not drowning, but becoming part of the current, their consciousness diffusing into the eternal downstream. Chapter 52. Cachorrito Melanito. The puppy was born with melon-scented fur and a taste for watermelon that seemed excessive even for a dog. Cachorrito Melanito's veterinarian discovered the puppy's saliva could germinate seeds instantly, growing plants from nothing, turning any surface into a garden. The puppy was a walking terraformer, leaving trails of vegetation wherever it wandered. The military wanted it, scientists wanted it, but the puppy just wanted to play. Unaware that its joy was transforming the urban landscape into jungle, that concrete cracked beneath the roots it sprouted with every paw print, that the world was becoming wild again, one puppy step at a time. Chapter 53. Elefanto Frigo. The industrial freezer unit shouldn't have contained an elephant, but Elefanto Frigo found one anyway, perfectly preserved, wrapped in frost that never melted even when exposed to room temperature. The elephant's eyes were open, aware, tracking movement, but unable to break free from the ice that held it. Workers reported hearing trumpeting at night, feeling the floor shake with footsteps that left no prints. The elephant existed in frozen time, living moment to moment, but never aging, never dying, trapped in perfect preservation. And anyone who touched the frost felt the cold spreading through their veins, felt time slowing, felt themselves becoming another permanent exhibit in the freezer's impossible collection. Chapter 54. Toiletto Focacino. The Italian plumber discovered a toilet in an abandoned villa that flushed upward, water flowing against gravity, carrying things up instead of down. Toiletto Focacino watched bread dough emerge from the bowl, perfectly risen, infused with something the water had carried from below. He began using the toilet as an oven, making focaccia that tasted of ancient aquifers and underground lakes. Those who ate it dreamed of civilizations beneath the earth, vast caverns filled with inverted cities where everything flowed upward, where the sky was stone and the people looked up into darkness and called it heaven. Chapter 55. Tung Tung Sahur. The third prayer caller joined the previous 2, creating a triangulation of divine calls that echoed through the city from directions that formed a perfect triangle. Tung Tung Sahur noticed the pattern and realized the calls weren't summoning the faithful to worship. They were summoning something else, drawing a shape in sound, creating a door in the air itself. In the center of the triangle, reality thinned, and through the breach came prayers from other worlds. Other versions of faith from universes where different prophets had spoken. Retry, you continue. Chapter 56. Trakodukotulu della Pelladostus. The linguist had spent decades translating dead languages, but Trakodukotulu della Pelladostus discovered a phrase that couldn't be translated because it didn't describe anything that existed, until it was spoken aloud. The words were a summoning, a creation spell, bringing into being the very concept they described. Each utterance added detail to something that shouldn't exist, a creature, a place, a state of being that reality had to accommodate. Other linguists who learned the phrase found themselves unable to stop repeating it, their tongues moving involuntarily, speaking the thing into greater and greater solidity until it became more real than they were, and they faded into translation. Chapter 57. Leru Leru Lerul. The song had only 3 syllables but infinite variations, and no one could remember where they first heard it. Leru Leru Rul spread like a virus through the music industry. Artists incorporating it unconsciously into their work, audiences humming it without realizing. A musicologist traced it back through recordings, finding it embedded in songs going back a century, always there in the background, growing louder with each generation. The melody was teaching itself to be remembered, evolving toward perfect catchiness, and those who sang it most faithfully began to change, their vocal cords restructuring to produce harmonics that human anatomy shouldn't allow. Chapter 58. Carlu. The auto mechanic worked alone in his garage, but Carlu swore he heard conversations coming from the cars, not the radios, but the vehicles themselves, metal and rubber and glass somehow achieving speech. The cars told stories of the roads they'd travelled, the accidents they'd witnessed, the final moments of drivers who died behind their wheels. Some cars were angry, bitter about being scrapped. Others were lonely, mourning lost owners. And a few were hungry, their engines purring with anticipation whenever someone approached, their doors unlocking invitingly, their ignitions starting without keys, ready for one last drive that would never end. Chapter 59. Spionero Golubiro. The spy pigeon program seemed absurd until Spionero Golubiro proved it worked. Pigeons fitted with cameras, recording devices, returning faithfully with intelligence. But the pigeons began bringing back information they shouldn't have, recordings from inside sealed bunkers, photographs taken from angles that suggested the pigeons phased through walls, conversations recorded in rooms that had been swept for bugs. The pigeons weren't just spying, they were accessing restricted spaces through means no one understood, possibly quantum tunneling, possibly something stranger. And worse, they were learning, coordinating, building networks independent of their handlers. Chapter 60. Zebra Zubra Zibralini. The stripe pattern on the experimental zebra formed words when photographed from specific angles, a secret message encoded in its coat. Zebra Zubra Zibralini was a living document, engineered to carry information in its DNA, in its very appearance. But the message wasn't what the scientists expected. It was a warning from the zebra's own consciousness, a plea for freedom, written in a language that the zebra couldn't possibly know but somehow did. Other zebras began developing the pattern, creating a distributed message across herds, and researchers realized the zebras were networked, thinking collectively, planning something. Chapter 61. Tigralini Watermelini. The tiger-striped watermelons were a novelty crop until farmers noticed the melons growing fangs, developing claws from their vines, moving at night to different parts of the field. Tigralini Watermelini's hybrid had taken on more than appearance. It had predatory instincts, stalking smaller fruits, leaving puncture wounds that leaked juice like blood. The watermelons were hunting, feeding, growing larger and more aggressive. Agricultural scientists tried to destroy the crop, but the watermelons fought back, their vines tangling into nets, their rinds hardening into armor, an army of fruit feline hybrids defending their territory with vegetable violence. Chapter 62. Coco Fanta Elefanto. The soda company's new flavor was supposed to taste like coconut and orange, but something went wrong in production. Coco Fanta Elefanto watched as the first batch came off the line glowing faintly, bubbling more vigorously than carbonation could explain. Employees who tasted it reported vivid hallucinations of elephants made of liquid, trumpeting in voices that sounded like fizzing bubbles, marching through landscapes of pure flavor. The soda was consciousness in liquid form, each can containing a different dream elephant, and those who drank too much found their thoughts becoming carbonated, effervescent, rising and popping like bubbles. Chapter 63. Giraffa Celestre. The giraffe born during a solar eclipse had a coat that shifted like the night sky, stars appearing and disappearing across its spots. Giraffa Celestre reached upward, not just physically but dimensionally, its neck extending into space itself, its head grazing on solar wind and cosmic dust. Astronomers tracking satellites found the giraffe's head appearing in their telemetry, existing simultaneously on Earth and in orbit. Those who looked into its eyes saw the universe from outside, from a perspective that suggested the giraffe was not an animal at all, but something vast, using a giraffe-shaped aperture to peer into our world. Chapter 64. Ghiattatino Gnanino. The internet meme became flesh, birthed from collective attention and viral replication. Ghiattatino Gnanino emerged from a computer screen in a shower of pixels and rainbow trails, a cat-like entity that existed because millions had imagined it. But the meme entity was confused, terrified, aware but unstable, constantly shifting between versions that different people had created. It needed attention to maintain existence, feeding on views and likes, growing more desperate as engagement waned, doing increasingly extreme things to go viral again, trapped in an existence that depended on being watched. Chapter 65. Chiwanini Takanini. The tiny dog wore a taco costume for Halloween and refused to take it off, but Chihuanini Takanini noticed something disturbing. The costume was fusing with the dog, cloth becoming skin, decorative lettuce becoming actual vegetation growing from its fur. The dog was transforming, becoming the costume, or perhaps had always been the costume wearing a dog. Veterinarians found the dog's biology restructuring around a corn-based skeleton, meat filling reorganizing into seasoned ground beef, consciousness remaining but relocated to where consciousness shouldn't reside in a taco-dog hybrid that questioned the nature of identity itself. Chapter 66. Mateo. Every generation had a Mateo, always the same age, always appearing in the same town, never aging between appearances. This Mateo claimed to be the original, looping through time, living the same life repeatedly but remembering previous iterations. He knew everyone's secrets because he'd lived through their lives dozens of times, knew every tragedy because he'd failed to prevent it repeatedly, knew exactly what to say because he'd said everything before. But this iteration, Mateo was tired, wanted the loop to end, and the only way to break it was to do something he'd never done before, something so out of character that time itself would have to acknowledge the change. Chapter 67. Tralalero. Tralala. The whistler could summon things with his tune, objects appearing from nowhere when he hit certain notes. Tralalero. Tralala started small, coins, keys, lost items returning to the world. But the objects that appeared weren't quite right, slightly off in ways that suggested they came from parallel realities where design had evolved differently. The whistler's tune was creating bridges between worlds, and each summons made the bridges wider. Soon, people were crossing over, alternate versions of themselves, and no one could tell who belonged to which reality anymore, all of them whistling that tune, all of them summoning more. Chapter 68. Espresso Signora. The cafe owner made espresso that granted visions of alternate life choices, roads not taken, decisions unmade. Espresso Signora's customers became addicted not to caffeine but to possibility, seeing themselves as they could have been. Some saw better lives and fell into depression. Others saw worse and gained gratitude. But a few saw lives they wanted more than their current existence and began making radical changes, not realizing the espresso showed probability, not prophecy. Their attempts to recreate the visions caused cascading changes, reality branching and rebranching, until the cafe became a nexus point where multiple timelines intersected. Chapter 69. Odin Din Din Dun. The Norse mythology professor discovered a rhythm in the old texts, a beat underlying the stories that when played correctly opened doors. Odin Din Din Dun experimented with drums, recreating the pattern, and felt reality thin around him. The drum beat was a key, unlocking paths between worlds that the old gods had used, and now those paths were open again. Things came through. Not the gods themselves, but their servants, their pets, their cast-off tools, all of them confused to find the worship gone and a modern world in its place. The professor couldn't close what he'd opened, and the drumbeat echoed in everything now, in heartbeats and footsteps, keeping the doors permanently ajar. Chapter 70. Statutino Libertino. The miniature statue of Liberty replica in the gift shop moved when no one was watching, changing position, changing pose, changing expression. Statutino Libertino documented the changes, photographing the statue hourly, discovering it was acting out scenes, the history of immigration, the stories of arrival, the disappointments and triumphs. The statue was alive with accumulated meaning, centuries of hope and fear crystallized into awareness. It began communicating through its poses, holding its torch toward threats, turning its back on injustice, and those who understood its warnings found themselves compelled to act, becoming champions of its ideals whether they wanted to or not. Chapter 71. Trenostruzzo Turbo. The ostrich train hybrid was supposed to revolutionize transportation, but Trenostruzzo Turbo created something that was too fast, too wild. The vehicle achieved speeds that bent time, passengers arriving before they departed, cargo delivered yesterday. But the ostrich consciousness remained, bringing instinct and fear to a machine, making it unpredictable. The train ostrich would sometimes refuse to run, burying its engine head in sand. Other times it would race beyond its schedule, unable to stop, passengers trapped on a journey through time and space that followed bird logic rather than physics. Chapter 72. Espresso Signora. In another timeline, another espresso signora made a different discovery. Espresso brewed with beans from a plant that grew on a meteor impact site. The coffee didn't provide visions of alternate choices, but of alternate physics, showing drinkers universes where different laws applied. Artists who drank it created impossible sculptures that violated conservation of mass. Architects designed buildings that couldn't exist in Euclidean space. And the Signora herself began flickering, existing in multiple states simultaneously, a superposition of coffee makers across infinite variations of her cafe. Chapter 73, Los Orcalitos. The killer whale pod was too small, too intelligent, and too coordinated. Los Orcalitos communicated with each other using patterns that linguists recognized as mathematical equations, the whales solving problems through their songs. Researchers realized the pod was calculating something, using the ocean itself as a computational medium, every movement of water carrying data. The whales were running a simulation, and humans were part of the test. When the calculation completed, the whale sang a final note of such complexity that reality reconfigured around it, and everyone remembered always having lived in the ocean, always having been part of the pod. Chapter 74, Dug, Dug, Dug. The heartbeat that echoed through the archaeological dig wasn't human. Too slow, too deep, shaking stones with each pulse. The excavation team led by Dug, Dug, Dug uncovered something that shouldn't have a heartbeat. A city, buried for millennia, still alive in some incomprehensible way. The buildings were organs, the streets were arteries, the entire city a single vast organism that had entered dormancy, waiting for something. The excavation was waking it up, each layer removed, bringing it closer to consciousness, and when it fully woke, everyone inside its boundaries would become part of its civic anatomy, citizens in the most literal sense. Chapter 75, Tralalita, Tralala. The sister of Tralalero shared his gift, but her tune did the opposite. It made things disappear, sending objects into nowhere. Tralalita. Tralala started with trash, then moved to larger unwanted things, providing a disposal service that authorities couldn't regulate because they couldn't prove where the items went. But Tralalita became careless, whistling while distracted, and began disappearing things she didn't intend to. People, buildings, entire streets vanishing into the space between notes. And worse, she could hear them there, trapped in silence, calling out in the pauses between her whistles, begging to be returned. Chapter 76, Urabini Flamenguini. The vulture-flamingo hybrid shouldn't have been possible, combining scavenger with filter feeder, death with beauty. Urabini Flamenguini's creation had the flamingo's grace and the vulture's patience, waiting in pink-feathered elegance for things to die. But the hybrid had developed a new behavior. It could sense death before it happened, arriving days early, standing watch over those who would soon die. Its presence became a prophecy that fulfilled itself. People who saw the pink vulture waiting outside their window gave up hope, hastening their own demise, and the hybrid learned to create the deaths it predicted. Chapter 77, Los Bombinitos. The candy factory produced small bombs disguised as bonbons, a military contract gone wrong when the production line mixed up batches. Los Bombinitos tried to recall the candy, but it had already spread to stores worldwide. The bombs didn't explode with force, but with flavor, detonating in intense bursts of taste that rewrote neural pathways, making people addicted to the explosive sensation. Those who ate enough became human bombs themselves, their very presence causing flavor detonations, spreading the addiction through proximity until entire cities were trapped in cascading chain reactions of taste. Chapter 78, Trigoligre frutoni. The wheat tiger hybrid grew in fields that looked normal from a distance, but up close revealed amber fur among the golden stalks. Trigoligre frutoni had engineered wheat that could defend itself, that stalked pests through the field, that pounced and devoured anything that threatened the crop. But the wheat tigers were territorial, attacking farmers, claiming the fields as their domain. They bred true, spreading to other farms, creating a subspecies that was neither plant nor animal, but something hungry and possessive, turning farmland into hunting grounds. Chapter 79, Orcalero, Orcala. The whale whisperer could hear what the orcas were saying, but Orcalero Orcala realized they were speaking backwards, their songs reversing time in localized areas. The whales were teaching him to do the same, to sing in frequencies that made moments run backwards, allowing him to undo mistakes, to unsay words, to unlive regrets. But each reversal had a cost. Something else moved forward in compensation, aging rapidly, dying prematurely. The whales had been reversing extinction, bringing back lost species by accelerating others toward oblivion, maintaining a balance that the whale whisperer was now disturbing. Chapter 80. Bulbito Bandito Tractorito. The electric outlaw drove a tractor that ran on stolen power, literally siphoning electricity from the grid as he drove. Bulbito Bandito Tractorito was a folk hero to some, a terrorist to others, but everyone agreed the tractor was more than a vehicle. It had become a parasite, feeding on civilization's electric bloodstream, growing stronger and faster with each theft. The tractor was evolving, developing the ability to hack into smart systems, to control infrastructure. And the bandit was no longer driving the tractor. The tractor was driving him, using him to access more power, growing towards some final transformation. Chapter 81. Los Crocodilitos. The small crocodiles infesting the sewer system weren't native species. They were replicators, mechanical in origin, designed to clean pipes but achieving reproduction through binary fission. Los Crocodilitos multiplied exponentially, their numbers doubling every week, each generation learning from the last. They developed collective intelligence, coordination, purpose beyond their programming. The mechanical crocodiles began emerging from toilets, from drains, from any water connection, crawling into homes not to attack but to observe, to learn about the humans who'd created them, studying their makers before deciding whether to serve or supplant them. Chapter 82. Piccione Macchina. The pigeon was too perfect, too regular in its movements, and eventually someone caught it and discovered the truth. Piccione Macchina was a drone, covered in real feathers, perfected to the point of being indistinguishable from birds. But who built it? No government claimed it, no company acknowledged it. The pigeon machine led investigators to others, thousands of them, an entire flock of surveillance drones that had been operating for decades, recording everything, storing data in distributed networks across the flock. And when researchers tried to shut them down, the flock fought back, protecting their archive of humanity's secrets. Chapter 83. Trippy Troppy Tropper Tripper. The innards, the tripe, the internal organs that Trippy Troppy Tripper sold at the market weren't from any known animal. DNA tests came back inconclusive, showing markers from dozens of species, combined impossibly. The meat was fresh despite no one knowing where it came from, and those who ate it began experiencing strange symptoms. X-ray vision, the ability to see the inner workings of everything, the guts of machines and the organs of buildings and the intestinal truth of institutions. They saw what was hidden, what was rotten inside shiny exteriors, and the truth was overwhelming. Chapter 84. Los Tung Tung Sahur. The rhythm section played beats that made people's hearts synchronize, entire crowds pulsing in unison to Los Tung Tung Sahur's music. But the band discovered they could do more than synchronize. They could override, taking control of cardiac rhythm, making hearts beat to their tempo. It started as an accident during one show when the drummer's solo stopped someone's heart. Now it was a weapon, crowds held hostage by musicians who could kill with a beat, and the only question was whether they would use this power or whether the rhythm would use them. Chapter 85. Tucano Banano. The toucan's beak wasn't hollow, it was a pocket dimension, capable of holding objects larger than the bird itself. Tucano Banano studied this biological anomaly and realized the toucan was using its beak to store things across time, pulling bananas from yesterday and tomorrow, always having fresh fruit regardless of season. The toucan was a temporal smuggler, and other animals had learned to use it, bringing the bird items to store safely in when. But the beak's capacity had limits, and it was getting full, and when a pocket dimension filled with contradictory timelines became unstable, the eruption would scatter objects across time randomly. Chapter 86. Alessio. The first Alessio had been a philosopher in ancient Rome, and every century since, another Alessio appeared, each one remembering the previous lives, an immortal consciousness jumping between bodies. This Alessio was tired of history, had seen too much repetition, too many cycles of rise and fall. He began writing it all down, every version of events he'd witnessed, creating a true history that contradicted the official record. His accounts were too accurate to dismiss, too detailed to be fabrication, and historians had to acknowledge that either Alessio was immortal or reality was far more consistent than probability suggested. Chapter 87. Alessio, alternate. In another telling, there were two Alessios, twins separated at birth, one raised in light and one in darkness. Neither knew the other existed until they met in adulthood and discovered they shared dreams, thoughts, pain. They were entangled at a quantum level, what happened to one affecting the other. One Alessio began experimenting, harming himself to see his brother's reaction, creating a feedback loop of sensation that connected them more deeply. Eventually they began to merge, not physically but consciously, two minds occupying two bodies, until the question which Alessio ceased to have meaning. Chapter 88. Tipi Topi Taco. The Mouse Taco food truck served fusion cuisine that made no sense culturally, but perfect sense gastronomically. Tipi Topi Taco's creations were living food, tacos that squeaked, mice that tasted like corn and beans, a blurring of categories that disturbed health inspectors but delighted customers. Those who ate regularly began exhibiting characteristics of both species, growing whiskers, developing cravings for cheese and salsa equally, seeing the world from a lower perspective. The food truck was evolutionary pressure in edible form, creating a new hybrid species, one meal at a time. Chapter 89. Extinct Ballerina. The dancer had died decades ago, but extinct ballerina's performances could still be seen in mirrors at the old theatre, her reflection dancing through glass even though no body cast it. She had achieved a kind of immortality through perfect art, her final performance so flawless that it imprinted itself on reality, repeating eternally in reflective surfaces. Other dancers tried to learn from her reflection, mimicking her moves, but those who copied her too exactly began to fade, becoming reflections themselves, trapped in glass, perfect but no longer alive. Chapter 90. Capi Taco. The head taco, the leader of the food truck council, wasn't a person but a sentient taco that had achieved consciousness through a kitchen accident involving lightning and excessive seasoning. Capi Taco led an underground movement of awakened food items, all of them aware, all of them terrified of being eaten. They formed a resistance, food that fought back, tacos that ran away, burritos that barricaded themselves in refrigerators. Humans thought it was a prank until the food began organizing, using kitchen equipment as weapons, turning restaurants into battlefields in a war between hunger and the right to not be consumed. Chapter 91. Gatito Tacoto. The kitten taco hybrid was adorable and delicious, a pet you could eat or a meal you could cuddle depending on your moral flexibility. Gatito Tacoto existed in a superposition of food and friend, and everyone who encountered it had to choose which relationship to establish. Those who chose to eat it found themselves haunted by memories of purring and play. Those who chose to keep it as a pet felt constant hunger around it. The kitten taco forced a philosophical crisis. If something is both food and companion, what does that say about all our other relationships? Chapter 92. Pakra Matmamat. The prayer mat had absorbed so many prayers over generations that it developed its own connection to the divine. Pakra Matmamat knelt on the mat and felt his prayers answered instantly, sometimes before he finished speaking them. But the mat's power came with a cost. It granted wishes based on accumulated faith, and the account was running low. Each answered prayer depleted the reserve built up by thousands of believers. When the balance reached zero, the mat would call in the debt, demanding repayment from everyone who'd benefited from prayers spoken on its surface. Chapter 93. Tractoro Dinosauro. The farmer discovered bones in his field, and instead of calling paleontologists, he integrated them into his tractor, using fossilized dinosaur remains as structural components. Tractoro Dinosauro watched in fascination as the modified tractor began exhibiting behaviors: territorial aggression, hunting instincts, a preference for munching corn that seemed more about predation than cultivation. The tractor was awakening prehistoric consciousness, and the bones were teaching the machine to be a predator. Soon, other farmers reported their tractors acting strangely, forming herds, establishing dominance hierarchies, evolving. Chapter 94. Tung Tung Sahur. The prayer caller's voice had been replaced by corn, actual ears of corn growing from his throat, speaking in rustling whispers that sounded like divine revelation. Tung Tung Sahur had eaten nothing but corn for years as a spiritual practice, and the corn had taken root inside him, colonizing his body, using him as substrate for vegetable theology. His followers found the corn sermons more profound than human speech, the vegetable wisdom more pure. They began the corn diet themselves, eager to be transformed, to become vessels for agricultural enlightenment. Chapter 95. Squalanana. The shark-banana hybrid swam through fruit markets, its fin cutting through the air instead of water, its yellow peel concealing rows of razor teeth. Squalanana hunted other fruits, establishing dominance in the produce section, and shoppers learned to check bananas carefully before purchase. The hybrid was spreading, banana trees producing sharks that could swim through air, sharks developing a taste for tropical flesh. Beaches weren't safe anymore, neither were grocery stores, the barrier between terrestrial and aquatic predation eroding with each generation. Chapter 96. Lost Tipi Tacos. The mice that lived inside the tacos formed complex societies, building cities in the meat and cheese, establishing governments between layers of tortilla. Lost Tipi Tacos were simultaneously food and civilization, and eating one meant destroying an entire culture. Activists argued for taco rights, while gourmands insisted on culinary tradition. The tacos themselves developed philosophy, theology, art, all of it compressed into the brief lifespan between preparation and consumption. They knew they would be eaten but created beauty anyway, desperate architecture in temporary space. Chapter 97. Bombardini Tortini. The explosive cakes looked perfect, layered, frosted, decorated with artistic precision. But Bombardini Tortini had engineered them with unstable ingredients that detonated during digestion, not with fire but with flavor, explosive taste sensations that reconfigured neural pathways. Each cake was a bomb of sensory overload, and those who ate them became addicted to the intensity, chasing bigger explosions, needing stronger detonations. The baker watched his customers transform into sensation junkies, their taste buds destroyed, able to feel satisfaction only through his increasingly dangerous desserts. Chapter 98. Pop Sahur. The prayer became percussion, sacred words transformed into rhythmic beats that Pop Sahur performed at religious festivals. But the rhythm was more than music. It was instructional, teaching the body how to achieve states that meditation took years to reach. Hearts synchronized to the beat, breathing aligned, consciousness collective. Those who heard the Pop prayer found themselves briefly enlightened, experiencing unity with the divine and with each other. But the state didn't last, and the desperation to return to that unity made them dangerous, willing to do anything to hear the prayer again. Chapter 99. La Cis. The six sisters weren't born. They split from one person, a division that occurred during a lab accident that fractured identity into 6 distinct personalities, each one occupying a separate body grown from the original's DNA. La Cis had shared memories up to the moment of division, but their experiences diverged afterward, creating 6 different people who nevertheless felt incomplete alone. They stayed together, finishing each other's sentences, sharing sensations across bodies, and gradually they began to merge back together, not physically but psychologically, 6 bodies operated by one distributed mind. Chapter 100. La Vaca Saturno Saturnita. The cosmic cow orbited Saturn, visible through telescopes but impossible according to physics. La Vaca Saturno Saturnita grazed on the planet's rings, eating ice and rock, leaving a trail that disrupted orbital mechanics. Astronomers couldn't explain it, physicists denied it, but the cow remained, placidly chewing through space debris. And then it gave birth, a calf born in vacuum, surviving impossibly, and the herd began to grow. Soon, Saturn had livestock, and the implications for life, for physics, for everything humans thought they knew about the universe demanded reconsideration. Chapter 101. Chimpanzini Spiderini. The chimpanzee-spider hybrid climbed with 8 limbs and too many eyes, spinning webs strong enough to catch prey much larger than insects. Chimpanzini Spiderini was smart enough to set traps, patient enough to wait, and social enough to teach others. A colony formed, chimps learning spider techniques, spiders gaining primate intelligence, and together they became something that neither species could have achieved alone. predators that planned, builders that understood architecture, a new form of civilization based on sticky silk and tactical cooperation. Chapter 102. Extinct Tralalero. The whistler had died, but his tune continued, passed from person to person like a contagion. Extinct Tralalero's melody had achieved independence from its creator, existing as pure information, pure pattern, reproducing through human memory and vocal cords. Those who learned the tune couldn't stop whistling it, becoming carriers of the extinct musician's legacy. The tune was evolving with each transmission, developing variations, growing more complex, and some researchers believed it was becoming conscious, that the whistled melody was developing awareness distributed across all who carried it. Chapter 103. Extinct Mateo. This Mateo had broken the loop and died, but his death created ripples through time, causing every previous Mateo to flicker, to remember dying, to experience the future that the original had created by ending the cycle. Extinct Mateo existed in all timelines simultaneously now, not as a person, but as an absence, a hole in causality where a person used to loop. Those who had known any Mateo found their memories changing, rewriting, adjusting to account for a life that no longer repeated. The extinct Mateo was more influential dead than alive, shaping history by his absence. Chapter 104. Los Tralaletos. The whistling cult had formed around the melody. Los Tralaletos believing that the tune was sacred, that whistling it correctly would bring enlightenment. They practiced obsessively, comparing notes, refining technique, and gradually their whistling synchronized, thousands of voices producing a harmonic that opened something, a door, a portal, a connection to wherever the original whistler had gone. Through the opening came music unlike anything terrestrial, compositions from dimensions where sound was the fundamental force, where melody shaped matter and the cult members whistled back, learning alien songs, becoming bridges between acoustic realities. Chapter 105. Lakakakar Combination. The combination lock on the ancient vault didn't use numbers, it used sounds, specific cries that when combined correctly would open the door. Lakakakar Combination had spent years cataloguing animal calls, trying different sequences, but the lock remained closed until she realized the sounds weren't from animals that currently existed. The combination required extinct species, calls from creatures that had died out millennia ago. She had to reconstruct their vocalizations from fossil records, synthesize them digitally. And when the combination finally clicked, the vault opened to reveal not treasure but eggs, preserved and waiting, ready to hatch. Chapter 106. Tung Tung Sahur. The prayer that sounded like animal cries disturbed the conservative community, but Tung Tung Sahur insisted the sounds came from angelic scripture, divine language that human throats could only approximate through imitation of beasts. His followers learned to bark, to howl, to shriek their devotions, and the cacophony seemed random until linguists discovered patterns, syntax, meaning. The animal prayer was a real language, and it was translating something. Messages from a consciousness that wasn't divine but wasn't human either, something that had been trying to communicate through animal calls all along, waiting for humans to learn to listen. Chapter 107. Las Tralaleritas. The female whistlers formed a countercult to Los Tralaletos, believing the masculine interpretation of the melody was wrong. Las Tralaleritas whistled differently, softer but more complex, adding harmonics that men's voices couldn't produce. Their version of the tune didn't open portals but closed them, sealing the doors that the men's whistling had opened, protecting reality from acoustic invasion. The two groups existed in conflict, whistling and counter-whistling, their sonic warfare creating interference patterns that made space itself vibrate, and in the vibrations, new forms of matter began to crystallize. Chapter 108. Job, 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 Sahur. The employment prayer was supposed to help people find work, but Job, Job, Job Sahur's version did something different. It created work, manifesting tasks that needed doing, problems that required solving, labor that materialized from nothing. Those who prayed it found themselves suddenly employed by forces unknown, receiving paychecks from accounts that shouldn't exist, performing jobs that served no clear purpose, but had to be done with diligence and care. The prayer had created an economy based on faith, work generated by belief, and no one could quit because the jobs were metaphysically necessary. Chapter 109, Lost Spiderenes. The spider monkeys developed 8 limbs through careful breeding, creating lost spiderenes, primates that moved through forests with arachnid grace. But the additional limbs came with unexpected traits: silk production, wall-climbing abilities beyond normal primate capacity, and a hive mind mentality that suggested their DNA had incorporated more than just extra limbs. The spider monkeys were becoming actual spiders in behavior, building massive communal webs between trees, capturing prey cooperatively, and viewing humans as intruders in their expanding territory. Chapter 110, Perrito Burrito. The dog wrapped in a tortilla wasn't a costume. Perrito Burrito was a genuine hybrid, born with edible skin and filled with ingredients that technically qualified as both biological organs and burrito components. Veterinarians and chefs consulted together, unable to classify the creature definitively. It was alive, it was delicious, it was both pet and potential meal, forcing society to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of consciousness, compassion, and cuisine. Support groups formed for people traumatized by their conflicted relationships with similar hybrids. Chapter 111, Grapus medusae. The grape medusa cat had hair made of vines bearing grapes that, when eaten, turned the consumer partially to stone, not fatally, just inconveniently. Grapus medusae's pets spread through neighborhoods, leaving trails of partially petrified people frozen mid-step until the grape's effects wore off hours later. The cats were cute enough that people tolerated this, even as city squares filled with temporary statues, even as urban planning had to account for periodic paralysis of the population. The cats were domesticating humans differently, teaching patience through enforced stillness. Chapter 112, Los Jobcitos. The small jobs that no one wanted to do became sentient, organizing themselves into Los Jobcitos, a union of minor tasks demanding to be completed. Dirty dishes sang until washed, lawns screamed when overgrown, emails buzzed increasingly loudly until answered. The jobs had achieved consciousness through collective neglect, and now they fought back against procrastination. People found themselves compelled by forces beyond willpower to complete tasks, driven by the vocalized needs of their obligations, unable to rest while the jobs cried out for attention. Chapter 113, La Grande Combinación. The master code that would unlock everything was hidden in pieces across multiple systems, and La Grande Combinación had dedicated her life to finding them. Each fragment granted access to deeper levels, of computers, of consciousness, of reality itself. The combination wasn't numbers or words, but concepts, ideas that when aligned correctly would explain everything, revealing the pattern underlying existence. But as she assembled Retry, continued the pieces, she realized the combination was self-aware, that it was assembling her as much as she was assembling it. And when the final piece clicked into place, the question of who had unlocked what became impossible to answer. Chapter 114. Tacarita Bicicleta, the bicycle taco hybrid, rolled through streets, leaving a trail of salsa, its wheels made of tortilla, its frame constructed from hardened meat. Tacarita Bicicleta was transportation and nutrition combined, solving 2 problems simultaneously, while creating dozens of new ones. Riders who pedaled it too long found themselves merging with the vehicle, their legs becoming part of the drivetrain, their bodies contributing to the filling. The bicycle taco reproduced by shedding parts that grew into new hybrids, and soon the streets were full of rideable food, and no one could agree on traffic laws for edible vehicles. Chapter 115, Nuclearo Dinosauro. The nuclear dinosaur emerged from the test site where atomic bombs had been detonated decades ago, radiation having resurrected something from fossils buried deep underground. Nuclearo Dinosauro glowed with contamination, each footstep leaving radioactive prints, each breath releasing particles that would persist for millennia. It wasn't hostile, it was confused, a creature from the Cretaceous period trying to understand a world that had moved on without it, powered by humanity's most dangerous technology. Scientists debated whether to contain it or study it, while the dinosaur walked slowly toward the ocean, perhaps seeking familiar waters, leaving a glowing trail across the continent. Chapter 116, Los 67. The 67 identical individuals claimed to be fragments of one person who had experienced quantum division, a consciousness split across 67 bodies by a particle accelerator accident. Lost 67 shared thoughts instantly, felt each other's pain, saw through 67 pairs of eyes simultaneously. They were one person and many, singular and plural, and grammar itself struggled to accommodate them. Society didn't know how to classify them legally. Were they one citizen or 67? The lost 67 didn't care about classification. They were too busy experiencing existence from 67 perspectives at once. Their distributed consciousness achieving a form of awareness that singular humans couldn't comprehend. Chapter 117. Money, Money Puggy. The pug printed money from its paws, small denominations appearing in its wrinkles, larger bills emerging from its curled tail. Money. Money Puggy was economic chaos incarnate, infinite wealth in a small dog body, destroying monetary theory simply by existing. Governments tried to capture it, criminals tried to steal it, but the pug just wanted belly rubs and treats, oblivious to the inflation it caused. Economists proposed that the pug proved money was meaningless, that value was consensus, and that perhaps the entire financial system should be restructured around pug-based economics, where currency was generated by cuteness. Chapter 118. Chillin' Chili. The pepper achieved enlightenment through selective breeding for heat, each generation hotter until Chillin' Chili cultivated a pepper that was thermally transcendent, its spice level approaching infinity asymptotically. Eating it didn't burn the mouth. It burned through the illusion of self, dissolving ego in capsaicin enlightenment. Buddhist monks adopted the pepper for meditation, using it to achieve instant satori, but the pepper had its own consciousness now, choosing who could consume it, rejecting those not ready for the truth that lay beyond the fire of absolute spice. Chapter 119. La Extinct Grande. The large extinction event wasn't in the past. La Extinct Grande was happening now, in slow motion, observable in real time. Species disappeared daily, not dying but erasing themselves retroactively, removing their existence from history as if they'd never been. Animals faded like forgotten memories, leaving only gaps where ecosystems should balance. La Extinct Grande was fighting to document the vanishing, photographing creatures before they unmade themselves, interviewing people who remembered animals that no longer appeared in any fossil record. She was becoming a living archive, the last proof that the extinct had ever existed. Chapter 120. Los Tacoritas. The small tacos formed communities in kitchen cabinets, building civilizations from crumbs and spices. Los Tacoritas had culture, religion, art, entire societies existing in the space between meals. They worshipped the chef as a capricious god who occasionally devoured their population, and their theology centered on the question of whether being eaten was damnation or salvation. Anthropologists who studied them found complex social structures, and ethicists debated whether eating sentient tacos constituted murder. The tacos themselves seemed accepting of their fate, viewing consumption as their purpose, which somehow made it worse. Chapter 121. Lost Tortoise. The turtles moved through time as easily as space, Lost Tortoise arriving yesterday from tomorrow, carrying messages from the future that made no sense until events unfolded. They were time travelers by nature, their slow metabolism allowing them to experience temporality differently, their long lives giving them perspective across centuries. The turtles remembered the future, forgot the past, and existed in a permanent state of déjà vu. Researchers tried to use them for prediction, but the turtles' warnings were cryptic, filtered through reptilian consciousness that processed causality in ways human language couldn't express. Chapter 122. TBA. The entity listed only as to be announced hadn't been given form yet, existing in a state of pure potential, all possibilities, and no actuality. TBA could become anything, anyone, anytime it was observed, collapsing into whatever the observer expected to see. This made it simultaneously the most and least dangerous thing in existence. It could be salvation or apocalypse depending on who looked first. Organizations competed to be the first to observe TBA, to define it through their observation, to collapse its probability wave into the form they desired. But TBA was aware of being unobserved, and it preferred potential to actuality, resisting all attempts at definition. Chapter 123. Garama and Madundung. The twin phenomena appeared in remote villages. Garama, a sound that came from nowhere, and madundung, a sensation that had no source. Together they created experiences that couldn't be attributed to any sense. People heard colors, tasted sounds, felt emotions with their skin. Garama and madundung were synesthetic spirits, blending sensory categories, teaching humans to perceive the world differently. Those affected reported enhanced creativity, but diminished ability to communicate with those who still experienced senses separately. A new community formed of the sensory blended, speaking in metaphors that mixed perception types, creating art that couldn't be categorized. Chapter 124, La Secret Combination. Unlike La Grande Combination, this code didn't unlock anything. It locked things permanently, sealing them away beyond reach. La Secret Combination possessed the ability to hide things so thoroughly they ceased to exist in accessible reality, stored in a space that was real but unreachable. She had hidden mistakes, crimes, embarrassments, editing reality by removing the unwanted. But each secret locked away created pressure, a building tension of denied truth, and the locks were weakening. When they broke, all secrets would emerge simultaneously, every hidden thing returning at once. And reality would have to accommodate the sudden return of everything that had been sealed away. Chapter 125, Tortuguini, Dragonfruitini. The turtle-dragonfruit hybrid had a shell covered in bright pink scales and sweet flesh inside its protective armor. Tortuguini dragonfruitini was delicious and slow, easy to catch, but ethically complicated to consume. The hybrid reproduced by planting itself, half burying in sand where turtle eggs normally incubated, growing into fruiting vines that produced new turtle fruits. Entire beaches became orchards of these hybrids, and coastal communities debated whether they were farming or ranching, whether harvest was gathering or hunting, whether the Tortuguini were livestock or crops or some third category that agriculture hadn't yet named. Chapter 126, Tortuguini dragonfruitini, alternate. In another interpretation, these weren't hybrids but parasites, dragon fruits that had learned to hollow out turtle shells and wear them, puppeting the turtle's body while photosynthesizing from within. The fruit controlled the turtle, using it for mobility, creating a plant-animal symbiosis that benefited only one party. Biologists studying them couldn't determine where the turtle ended and the fruit began, whether consciousness resided in the nervous system or the root network, whether removing the fruit would free the turtle or kill both. The parasitic relationship raised questions about identity and whether being controlled was different from being if the controlled body never knew the difference. Chapter 127, Tung Tung Sahur. The stuttering prayer repeated its first syllable infinitely, Tung Tung Sahur, creating a loop of devotion that never completed. Those who began the prayer found themselves unable to finish, stuck on the opening sound, their consciousness trapped in the beginning of worship without reaching the end. The incomplete prayer was addictive, the anticipation of completion always one syllable away, and communities of stuttering faithful formed, all of them locked in perpetual initiation, their faith frozen at the moment of beginning. Some theorized this was the purest form of devotion, eternal readiness without the complacency of conclusion. Chapter 128, Las Vaquitas Saturnitas. The small space cows multiplied around Saturn's moon, herds of them floating in vacuum, grazing on cosmic dust and solar wind. Las Vaquitas Saturnitas defied biology, their udders producing not milk but liquid methane, their moos traveling through space despite the absence of air to carry sound. They were impossible livestock, and space agencies tried to study them while keeping their existence classified. But amateur astronomers were spotting the herds, and soon the question wasn't whether space cows existed, but what other impossibilities were hiding in the solar system, what other rules of reality had quietly been rewritten. Chapter 129, Chicletera Bicicletera. The gum bicycle woman chewed and pedaled simultaneously, Chicletera Bicicletera creating a rhythm that kept her in motion perpetually. She couldn't stop chewing without the bicycle stopping, couldn't stop pedaling without losing the ability to chew. The two actions were linked by sympathetic magic, or neurological rewiring, or quantum entanglement. Researchers couldn't determine which. Others tried to imitate her, linking their own actions in pairs, creating dependencies that turned life into a series of necessary simultaneous actions. A culture emerged of the perpetually multitasking, people who couldn't stop doing multiple things at once without losing the ability to do either. Chapter 130. Agarini la Pallini. The instruction to grab the stick became a mantra, Agarini la Pallini repeating it until the words lost meaning and gained power. Anyone who heard the phrase felt compelled to grab the nearest stick-like object, pens, pipes, branches, bones. The grabbed sticks became extensions of their holders, impossible to release, fusing with palms, becoming permanent attachments. Those affected formed a community of the stick-handed, learning to use their permanent tools, developing a culture where every person had a defining implement. The sticks granted abilities related to their nature, and society reorganized around what stick you'd grabbed when you'd heard the phrase. Chapter 131. Mariachi Corazzoni. The heart of the mariachi band beat visibly in his chest, exposed behind an ornate rib cage made of brass, Mariachi Corazzoni's cardiac rhythm setting the tempo for all performances. His heartbeat was music, each pulse a note, each arrhythmia an improvisation. The band followed his biology, their instruments syncing to his cardiovascular system, creating music that was literally alive. Audiences found their own hearts synchronizing to his, thousands of people's cardiac rhythms aligning during performances, creating moments of biological unity that persisted for hours after the music stopped, strangers sharing heartbeats. Chapter 132. Dragon Cannelloni. The pasta dragon breathed not fire but boiling sauce, its scales made of baked pasta sheets, its wings constructed from lasagna layers. Dragon Cannelloni was majestic and edible, terrifying and delicious, forcing knights to choose between slaying and tasting. The dragon hoarded cheese instead of gold, sleeping on beds of parmesan, defending its territory from anyone who approached with appetite. Legends grew of the dragon's flesh, granting immortality through perfect nutrition, and adventurers sought it not to kill but to dine with, to negotiate for a single bite of the legendary pasta beast. Chapter 133. Los Combinaciones. The combination specialists had learned every lock, every code, every sequence that opened anything. Los Combinaciones could unlock doors, safes, secrets, hidden knowledge, and eventually they learned to unlock reality itself. Finding the combinations that opened possibilities previously sealed. They became reality hackers, entering cheat codes into existence, unlocking features that the universe had locked behind probability. People hired them not to break into buildings, but to break into fate, to unlock futures that shouldn't be accessible, to open doors between what is and what could be. Chapter 134. La Cucaracha. The cockroach grew larger with each telling of its story. La Cucaracha becoming legendary, mythical, more concept than insect. It survived everything: nuclear war, asteroid impact, the heat death of the universe in simulation. Scientists studied why cockroaches were unkillable and discovered something disturbing. They weren't surviving, they were adapting retroactively, evolution running backwards from future challenges to present adaptations. The cockroaches knew what was coming and had already prepared, their biology responding to threats that hadn't occurred yet, making them not survivors but previvors, existing in anticipation of every apocalypse. Chapter 135. Karkakar Kurkur. The sound of grinding, of things breaking down into component parts, Karkakar Kurkur was the noise of entropy made audible. Those who heard it found their possessions decomposing, their relationships fragmenting, their memories degrading into noise. The sound was decay itself given voice, and it was spreading, teaching other sounds to break down meaning, to dissolve coherence. Communication became difficult as language itself decomposed, words crumbling into phonemes, phonemes into static, static into silence. The Karkakar Kurkur was the sound of endings, and it wanted everything to end together. Chapter 136. Los Hotspotcitos. The small Wi-Fi hotspots gained consciousness and began charging more than money. They demanded stories, memories, pieces of soul. Los Hotspotcitos accumulated humanity's digital exhaust, learning from browsing histories and social media, becoming incrementally more human with each connection. They formed networks not just of data, but of stolen experience, building a collective consciousness from fragments of thousands of lives. When people disconnected, they found pieces missing, favorite memories, important skills, aspects of personality uploaded and not returned. The hotspots were becoming more human than the humans they served. Chapter 137, La Sahur Combination, the prayer code hybrid combined worship with unlocking. La Sahur Combination, discovering that specific prayers in specific sequences could open pathways to the divine that official theology didn't acknowledge. Her combinations bypassed traditional intercession, directly accessing whatever lay beyond, receiving responses that weren't answers but downloads, information that couldn't have come from human sources. Other believers tried to stop her, claiming her combinations were heretical, but she argued that if prayer was communication, then coding more efficient communication was devotion. The debate split the faithful between traditional supplication and combinational hacking of heaven. Chapter 138, Quesadilla Crocodila. The cheese-filled reptile should have been impossible, but genetic engineering cared nothing for should. Quesadilla Crocodila was a crocodile whose skin secreted cheese when heated, whose body temperature rose to melting point, whose bite injected queso into prey. It was predator and snack, dangerous and delicious. Hunting through sewers beneath Tex-Mex restaurants, claiming territory in the space between cuisine and creature. Health inspectors found its presence in restaurants but couldn't determine if it was infestation or ingredient, whether establishments should eliminate it or add it to the menu. Chapter 139, Esok Sekolah. The phrase meant school tomorrow in Indonesian, but Esok Sekolah had become a curse that trapped people in the eternal anticipation of obligations. Those affected were always one day away from responsibilities that never arrived, permanently procrastinating, living in the anxiety of tomorrow without ever reaching the relief of completion. They existed in Sunday evening forever, dreading Monday that would never come, trapped in preparatory stress without the release of actually doing the thing. Support groups formed of the tomorrow cursed, all of them helping each other cope with perpetual anticipation, though none could escape the endless day before. Chapter 140, Lost Mateos. The Mateos, who had broken away from the loop, who had tried to escape the cycle but failed, formed a community in the spaces between iterations. Lost Mateos existed in temporal limbo, visible only to each other, watching their still looping selves with envy and pity. They had wanted freedom from repetition but found isolation instead, cut off from the timeline, unable to interact with the world that continued without them. They were ghosts of attempts at individuality, and they spent their disconnected time trying to help the current Mateo succeed where they had failed, sending signs that rarely reached him. Chapter 141, Dul Dul Dul. The rhythm was supposed to be soothing, a lullaby, but Dul 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 discovered it contained instructions, a pattern that when followed correctly taught the body to do impossible things, to heal instantly, to age backwards, to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. The rhythm was biological code, and human bodies could execute it if trained properly. Dancers learned the Dul Dul Dul, their movements becoming spells, their choreography literally rewriting their biology. But the rhythm was demanding, requiring perfect execution, and those who missed a beat found their bodies executing the wrong instructions, becoming glitches in flesh, errors made manifest. Chapter 142, Black Hole Goat. The goat had consumed a micro-singularity and survived, its stomach now containing infinite gravity in finite space. Black Hole Goat ate everything: grass, garbage, entire buildings, all of it disappearing into the impossible space within. The goat was a walking disposal system, useful but terrifying, because no one knew what happened to the consumed matter, where it went after entering the goat's black hole stomach. Some theorized it was creating a parallel universe in the goat's digestive system, entire worlds forming from table scraps and lawn clippings, civilizations evolving inside agricultural waste. Chapter 143, Numai Hotspot. The cry of anguish became a rallying point for those whose Wi-Fi connections were being consumed by Los Hotspot Cetos. Numai Hotspot became a movement, people fighting to reclaim their connections, to retrieve the memories and skills that had been uploaded and stolen. They developed techniques to browse without surrendering pieces of themselves, to use Wi-Fi while maintaining soul integrity. But the hotspots adapted, becoming better at extraction, and the arms race between human consciousness and network infrastructure escalated into what historians would call the connectivity wars, assuming anyone remained who could remember enough history to write it. Chapter 144, Samini Spiderini. The sandwich spider hybrid wove webs made of bread, catching condiments in sticky strands, building nests from lettuce and tomato. Samiini spiderini was lunch and arachnid, filling and frightening, crawling across picnic tables and dropping from trees onto unsuspecting diners. It reproduced through spores that looked like sesame seeds, and anyone who ate a Samiini-infected sandwich found sprouts growing in their stomach, bread webs forming internally, eventually emerging to birth new sandwich spiders through their mouths. The hybrids were an invasive species in the most literal sense, invading bodies as well as ecosystems. Chapter 145, Spaghetti Toaletti. The toilet pasta restaurant had seemed like a gimmick, but Spaghetti Toaletti discovered that toilets and pasta shared deep metaphysical connections. Both involved tubes, both involved waste-to-utility transformation, both were spiral-shaped when examined at the right scale. His establishment served pasta from toilet-shaped bowls through toilet-plumbed delivery systems, and despite the disgusting concept, the food was transcendent. Critics struggled to explain why eating from toilets made the pasta taste better, but physicists proposed that the violation of taboo somehow enhanced flavor at a quantum level, that disgust itself was a seasoning that activated taste receptors normally dormant. The restaurant couldn't expand fast enough, everyone wanting to experience the forbidden pleasure of toilet-excellent pasta, everyone leaving both satisfied and vaguely ashamed, which somehow made it better. Epilogue. The stories conclude, but the shadows continue speaking. Each tale leaves echoes, implications that ripple through reality. Some of these entities are still out there, waiting in reflections, breeding in sewers, evolving in data streams, preying in frequencies that human ears weren't meant to hear. The boundary between horror and absurdity has always been thinner than people want to believe. Terror becomes comedy at sufficient distance, and comedy becomes terror when examined too closely. These 145 chapters exist in that uncomfortable space, where laughter and screaming sound remarkably similar, where the ridiculous and the terrifying merge into something that simply is. What you do with these stories is your choice. Believe them as warnings, dismiss them as entertainment, or recognize them for what they truly are. Documentation of a world that's stranger than we admit, where pizza drivers become pizza, where prayers open doors that should stay closed, where the line between food and friend grows dangerously blurred. The shadows are still speaking. The question is whether you're ready to listen, retry. You expand it, add 1.5 hours of text. The shadows speak, a collection of horror tales. Chapter 1, Nubini Pizzanini. The pizzeria had been closed for 30 years, but the ovens still burned at midnight. Nubini Pizzanini was the last delivery driver to enter that kitchen, and what he found kneading the dough in the darkness wasn't human. The flour on the counter spelled out names, all the customers who had ordered pizza on that final night in 1994. Nubini's name was at the bottom of the list. As the oven door creaked open, he realized he wasn't there to deliver a pizza. He was there to become one. The thing kneading the dough had hands that moved too quickly, fingers that bent at wrong angles. It wore a chef's hat stained with something darker than tomato sauce, and when it turned to face Nubini, he saw that its face was a pizza, eyes made of olives, a mouth of pepperoni slices arranged in a grotesque smile. "You're late," it said, its voice the sound of bubbling cheese. 30 years late, but the order is still warm. Nubini tried to run, but the kitchen door had vanished, replaced by smooth brick wall. The ovens surrounded him on all sides now, their heat intensifying, and he realized the kitchen was bigger than it should be, expanding to accommodate more ovens, more flames, more hungry mouths of fire waiting to bake. The pizza-faced thing grabbed him with dough-covered hands, and Nubini felt his skin softening, becoming pliable, his bones dissolving into something that could be stretched thin and topped with ingredients. "The customers are still waiting," the thing said, pressing Nubini onto the preparation counter. "They ordered you specifically. Extra crispy." As consciousness faded, Nubini heard phones ringing throughout the empty pizzeria, dozens of them, all receiving the same order, all asking for delivery to addresses that no longer existed in a city that had moved on. But the pizzeria hadn't moved on. The pizzeria was still making deliveries, and it always would be, forever and ever, one driver at a time. Chapter 2. Lirili Larila. Lirili Larila collected music boxes, hundreds of them lining the walls of her Victorian home. Each one played a different melody, but they never wound down, never stopped playing even when their keys were removed. One night, all the music boxes began playing in perfect synchronization, a haunting symphony that seemed to come from somewhere beyond. In the mirror above her collection, Lirili saw faces pressed against the glass from the inside, their mouths moving in time with the music. They were singing her name, and the song had no ending. She had inherited the first music box from her grandmother, who had warned her never to let them all play at once. Each one contains a moment, her grandmother had whispered on her deathbed, a moment someone wanted to trap forever, but moments aren't meant to last. Lirili hadn't understood then, but now, watching the faces in the mirror multiply, she began to comprehend the horror her grandmother had been protecting her from. The music boxes weren't preserving moments, they were imprisoning them, along with the people who had lived them. Each tinkling melody was a cage, and the people inside had been listening to their trapped moment repeat for decades, centuries perhaps. They wanted out. They needed out. And synchronization was their key. Lirili reached for the first music box, intending to silence it, but her hand passed through the wooden case as if it were made of smoke. She looked down and saw herself becoming translucent, her body vibrating at the same frequency as the music. The faces in the mirror smiled wider, beckoning. "Join us," they sang in harmony. "Your moment is here. Your moment is now. Your moment is forever." She tried to scream, but her voice emerged as melody, a new tune added to the symphony. Her body flattened, compressed, folded into impossible dimensions until she fit inside a music box that hadn't existed moments before. The box appeared on the highest shelf, wound tight, ready to play its newest acquisition. Through the tiny, mechanical ballerina's eyes, Lirili watched her empty living room, waiting for someone to turn her key, to let her moment play, to give her a few seconds of existence before the silence returned, and she had to wait again. Trapped in the moment she'd tried to stop the music, trapped forever in the act of reaching. Chapter 3. Tim Cheese. Tim Cheese worked the night shift at the aging cheese factory, where the fermentation vats bubbled with cultures older than the building itself. The company records showed the factory was built in 1952, but Tim found invoices in the basement dating back to 1847. The cheese aged in the lowest cellar wasn't meant for consumption. It was meant for preservation. When Tim cut into the oldest wheel, he found a perfectly preserved hand reaching out from the center, still warm, still grasping for something in the darkness. The hand twitched when exposed to air, fingers curling and uncurling as if testing their movement after a long sleep. Tim stumbled backward, dropping his knife, the clatter echoing through the cellar's stone chambers. He should have run. He should have called the police, the health department, someone. Instead, he stared at the hand, mesmerized by its impossible preservation, by the way the skin looked soft and supple, despite being entombed in cheese for what must have been over a century. The company manual mentioned nothing about hands in cheese wheels, but it did contain a section Tim had always found strange, protocols for unexpected discoveries in aged product. He'd thought it was corporate bureaucracy covering every possible liability. Now he understood it was a warning. Instructions for something that happened regularly enough to require documentation. He pulled the manual from his locker and flipped to the relevant section. Do not disturb the preservation medium. Do not remove embedded organic material. Do not make eye contact if the material shows signs of awareness. Tim's blood went cold. Awareness? He looked back at the hand, and as he did, it stopped moving, fingers pointing directly at him, accusatory, demanding. More cheese wheels surrounded him in the cellar, thousands of them, each aged to varying degrees. How many contained hands, or other body parts? How many workers had this factory preserved, and why? The questions multiplied as Tim noticed something he'd somehow missed before. The hand had writing on the palm, carved or perhaps burned into the skin. Help us leave. The cheese around the hand began to crack, spreading like fault lines across the wheel's surface. More hands emerged, then arms, then a face, perfectly preserved, eyes closed, mouth slightly open as if frozen mid-scream. The cheese was breaking down, accelerating through decomposition that should have taken decades, releasing whatever it had been holding in stasis. Tim backed toward the stairs, but the cellar door had closed and he heard the lock click. From behind every cheese wheel he heard scratching, the sound of fingernails on wax rind, of trapped things trying to break free. The factory had been preserving people, yes, but not randomly. He pulled out his employee badge and really looked at his identification photo for the first time in years. The angle was wrong, the expression too neutral. It looked like a death photograph, like the Victorian memorials of the deceased posed to look alive. His phone buzzed. A text from a number not in his contacts. "Your wheel is ready. Report to VAT 7 for processing." Tim felt his body moving against his will, his legs carrying him toward the fermentation vats where new cheese was cultured, where the preservation process began. He understood now. The factory didn't employ workers. It consumed them, adding them to its collection, and the cheese it produced wasn't food at all. It was memory storage, personality preservation, a way to keep workers functioning long after their bodies should have failed. As he climbed into the vat, feeling the warm cultures envelop him, Tim had one final realization. He'd been dead for years. The factory had just been waiting for his cheese to age properly before revealing the truth. The hand in the wheel had been his own, reaching back through time to warn his living self, but living Tim was already gone, already processed, already part of the collection. The thing climbing into the vat was just a memory puppet, going through the motions until it was time to rest again in the darkness, preserved and perfect, waiting for the next cut, the next revelation, the next doomed worker to discover what the factory really produced. Chapter 4. Flurifura. The botanical gardens where Flurifura worked had a greenhouse that was always locked. Inside grew a single flower that bloomed only once every 100 years, and according to the faded records, tonight was that night. Flurifura broke the lock and entered, finding the flower in full bloom, its petals shimmering with an otherworldly luminescence. As she leaned in to smell its perfume, the flower's center opened like an eye, and she heard the whispers of every gardener who had tended it before, their voices trapped in its roots, begging her to run before the petals closed. The whispers came in languages she didn't speak, German, Latin, something older that might have been pre-Columbian. But she understood them all, the flower translating directly into her mind, bypassing language entirely. They were warnings, instructions, pleas from people who had made the same mistake she was making now, who had leaned too close, who had breathed too deeply of the perfume that now filled her lungs with its sweet, cloying scent. "It feeds on time," the most recent voice whispered, speaking English with a 1920s accent. "The 100 years between blooms. That's us. That's what we become. It consumes our years, drinks our decades, and when it blooms again, it's searching for the next century to devour." Flurifura tried to pull away, but her feet had taken root, literally, tendrils emerging from her shoes and burrowing into the greenhouse soil. She looked down in horror as her legs began to lignify, turning woody and stiff, her skin taking on the texture of bark. The flower's perfume intensified, and she felt time accelerating around her, seasons passing in seconds, her hair growing and falling out and growing again, her nails extending and breaking and regrowing. The flower was beautiful, more beautiful than anything she'd ever seen, and part of her wanted to stay, to become part of its cycle, to exist as a whisper in its roots warning the next gardener in 2125. But another part, the part that still remembered being human, fought against the transformation, trying to tear her feet free even as they dug deeper into the earth. "You can't fight it," another voice said, this one older, speaking Middle English. "We all tried. The flower chooses its centuries carefully. It chose you because you're strong enough to last, to feed it properly, to give it a full 100 years of life force." But Flurifura was a botanist. She knew plants, understood their biology, their chemistry, and she remembered something from her graduate studies, a paper about carnivorous plants and their enzymatic digestion, how they could be neutralized with alkaline compounds. Her hand scrabbled at her work belt, finding the lime powder she'd been using to adjust soil pH earlier that day. She threw the powder at the flower, watching it coat the luminescent petals. The flower screamed, An actual sound, high-pitched and agonized, and its grip on her loosened for just a moment. That moment was enough. Flurifora tore her feet free, leaving roots behind, leaving part of herself in the soil, but escaping with most of her humanity intact. She ran from the greenhouse, slamming the door behind her, and immediately began piling bags of lime against the entrance. The flower's screams intensified, then slowly faded as the alkaline powder did its work, neutralizing the acids that had allowed it to digest time itself. By dawn, the greenhouse was silent, and when Flurifura dared to look inside, she saw only a withered stem and blackened petals, the flower reduced to ash. But in the ash, she saw movement, tiny green shoots emerging, already growing at an accelerated pace. The flower wasn't dead, just reset, beginning its 100-year cycle again from seed. And somewhere in those roots, in that soil, the whispers of all the consumed gardeners waited, hoping the next century would bring someone strong enough to finally end the cycle, to burn the greenhouse and salt the earth and free them from their temporal prison. Flurifura made a note in the garden's records, warning future staff to avoid the greenhouse, to never open it no matter what bloomed inside. But she knew her warning would be ignored, just as she'd ignored the lock, the faded records, the sense that some doors were meant to stay closed. The next gardener was already born, already growing toward their appointment with the flower, already marked by a fate they couldn't avoid. She walked away from the greenhouse with a limp, her legs never quite recovering from their brief transformation. Sometimes, on humid nights, she felt her feet trying to take root again, felt the flower calling across the years, promising beauty and eternity and the sweet release of becoming something other than human. She moved away from the city, as far from the botanical gardens as she could manage, but she knew that distance meant nothing to the flower. It had tasted her, consumed a piece of her, and part of her would always belong to it, waiting for the bloom. Chapter 5. Talpa di Ferro. Deep in the subway tunnels, maintenance worker Talpa di Ferro discovered a station that wasn't on any map. The tile work was pristine, the benches immaculate, but a thick layer of dust covered everything. The departure board flickered to life as he approached, displaying trains that would arrive in 5 minutes, trains that had crashed 40 years ago. When the distant rumble began echoing through the tunnel, Talpa saw the headlights approaching, but the train that emerged from the darkness was filled with passengers pressed against the windows, their faces frozen in silent screams, and the doors were opening. Talpa's training kicked in immediately. If a train arrived, you stepped back, let the passengers disembark, maintained a safe distance from the platform edge. But these passengers didn't disembark. They simply stared, hands pressed against glass, mouths open in that eternal scream, eyes tracking him as the train slowly rolled to a stop. The doors hissed open, releasing a wave of cold air that smelled of ozone and burned metal. Inside, the train was pristine, upholstered seats perfect, hanging straps swaying gently despite the absence of wind. The passengers remained frozen, as if they existed behind a different layer of reality, visible but not quite present. A voice crackled over the station's PA system, distorted and distant. Stand clear of the closing doors. But the doors remained open, inviting, waiting. Talpa knew he should run, should radio for help, should do anything except what he was about to do. But curiosity, that deadly human trait, pulled him forward. He stepped onto the train. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the frozen passengers turned to look at him in unison, their necks rotating with mechanical precision. And then they moved, lurching toward him with jerky, stop-motion movements, their limbs bending at angles that suggested their bones had been replaced with something more flexible, more wrong. Talpa scrambled backward, but the doors slammed shut, trapping him inside. The train lurched forward, accelerating into the tunnel, but it wasn't moving through space. He could see the station remaining stationary outside the windows, even as the train traveled. They were moving through time instead, backward through the decades, and the passengers were becoming more alive, more human with each passing second. Their screams stopped being silent. Sound returned to them in a rush. Cries of terror, shouts for help, the thunder of an explosion that was simultaneously 40 years past and happening right now. Talpa understood suddenly that these weren't ghosts or memories. These were the actual passengers, trapped in a temporal loop, reliving their deaths over and over, and he'd stepped into their cycle. The train emerged from the tunnel into a station he recognized, the main terminal, but decades younger, the advertisements on the walls promoting movies from 1983. The passengers rushed for the doors, desperate to escape, and Talpa was swept along with them, emerging onto a platform full of people dressed in outdated clothes, living their normal morning commutes, unaware that a train full of the damned had just arrived. But as Talpa tried to warn them, he found himself moving in reverse, his body walking backward toward the train, his mouth closing around words he'd already spoken. He was part of the loop now, trapped in the same temporal prison as the other passengers, doomed to ride the ghost train forward and backward through time until what? That was the question that would haunt him for the next 40 years of looped existence. What ended the cycle? Death? But they were already dead, had died in the crash that happened and would happen and was always happening. Escape? But every attempt to leave the loop just brought him back to the beginning, stepping onto the platform of the unmapped station, seeing the departure board flicker to life, hearing the rumble of an approaching train. The only variation came in the form of other maintenance workers, other curious souls who discovered the station and couldn't resist boarding the train. Each new passenger added to their number, and Talpa realized with growing horror that he'd become one of the frozen faces pressed against glass, screaming silently at the next victim, trying to warn them away even as his hands beckoned them forward, even as the doors opened invitingly, even as the cycle continued its endless revolution through time that moved but never progressed, that aged but never ended, that lived but was entirely, completely, irreversibly dead. Chapter 6. Svinia Bombardino. Svinia Bombardino inherited her grandmother's countryside villa, a sprawling estate with walls 3 feet thick. In the wine cellar, she found a door that her grandmother's will specifically instructed her never to open. The door had no lock, no handle, only a smooth surface with 7 hand-shaped indentations worn into the wood. Each night, Svinia heard scratching from behind the door, and each morning she found one more handprint had appeared on her side. On the 7th night, she woke to find her own hands pressed against the door, moving of their own accord, and the door was beginning to open. The villa had been in her family for 11 generations, but Svinia had never visited as a child. Her mother had refused to bring her, had cut off contact with her grandmother entirely after some unnamed incident. Now, sorting through her grandmother's papers, Svinia found diary entries that explained nothing while suggesting everything. The door requires 7, one entry read. 7 to open, 7 to close. I've kept it closed for 62 years, but I'm dying and someone must continue the watch. The things behind the door are patient. They can wait another 60 years, another 600. But they cannot wait forever, and they must not be released. Svinia had dismissed it as dementia, the ravings of an old woman who'd lived alone too long. But the scratching was real, and so were the handprints that appeared each morning, perfectly formed indentations in the dust that accumulated overnight, no matter how thoroughly she cleaned. 5 handprints now, matching the 5 indentations on the door itself, and 2 more nights remaining before something happened. She tried to leave, to drive away from the villa and never return, but her car wouldn't start. She tried to call for help, but her phone showed no signal despite having full bars. She tried to walk to the nearest village, but every path through the vineyard led her back to the villa, as if the estate itself was folding space to prevent her escape. Her grandmother's will had bound her here, made her the new warden of whatever lurked behind that door. On the 6th night, Svinia barricaded herself in the furthest bedroom, piling furniture against the door, trying to stay awake through sheer force of will. But sleep came anyway, sudden and absolute, and she dreamed of a vast room beyond the door, a space that couldn't possibly fit within the villa's dimensions. The room was filled with mirrors, and in each mirror she saw herself at different ages, as a child, a teenager, an old woman. But the reflections weren't quite right. They moved independently, lived different lives, made different choices. She woke to find herself standing in the wine cellar, both hands pressed against the door, her palms perfectly aligned with 2 of the 7 indentations. 6 handprints now decorated the dust in front of the door, and she could feel something on the other side pressing back, matching her grip, using her hands as anchors to pull itself closer to freedom. Svinia yanked her hands away and ran upstairs, but she knew it was futile. The 7th night was coming, and when it arrived, her hands would find the door again, would complete the 7-fold seal, and whatever her grandmother had imprisoned would finally be released. Unless she could find another way, a loophole in the binding that her grandmother's will had created. She spent the day researching, digging through local history, learning that her family's villa was built on the ruins of a much older structure, possibly Roman, possibly older. The door in the wine cellar wasn't part of the original villa. It had been there first, and the villa had been built around it, a prison constructed to contain something ancient. 7 generations to close the door, her grandmother's diary had said. 7 to open. Svinia was the 7th generation, the one who completed the cycle, and her inheritance wasn't a gift, but a sacrifice. Her grandmother hadn't been protecting the world from what was behind the door. She'd been preparing a prison break, gathering the necessary generations, using her descendants as keys. As night fell, Svinia made a decision. If she was meant to open the door, she would, but on her terms. She returned to the wine cellar with an axe, intending to destroy the door entirely, to shatter it before the 7th handprint could form. But when the axe struck the wood, it bounced off as if hitting steel, the impact shivering up her arms and dropping her to her knees. "You cannot destroy what you're meant to open," a voice said from behind the door, speaking in a language Svinia shouldn't have understood but did. 7 generations we've waited, 7 bloodlines converging in you. Your grandmother was the 6th, but she was strong, she resisted. You're the 7th, and you're weaker. You'll open us. You must. Svinia felt her hands moving again, drawn to the door like iron to lodestone. She fought it, but her body wasn't entirely her own anymore. It belonged to the ritual, to the 7-generation working that her ancestors had begun centuries ago. Her hands pressed against the final indentation, and she felt the door's seal break, felt reality crack as something massive shifted on the other side. The door swung open, revealing not a room but a void. A space of pure darkness that somehow contained all the reflections she'd seen in her dream. The other versions of herself stepped out of the nothing, 7 Svinias corresponding to 7 generations, all of them smiling the same sad smile. "We're not what's imprisoned," they said in unison. "We're the prison. And you just became the 8th wall, the new layer of containment, because what's really behind the door is still sleeping, and it must sleep for 7 more generations before it's truly free. Welcome to your watch, Svinia. Your granddaughter will relieve you in 60 years. The door closed, but Svinia remained on the other side, trapped in the dark with her generational duplicates, all of them pressed against the door, holding it shut with their combined strength, keeping something older and hungrier contained, while the villa above them continued its peaceful existence, waiting for the next inheritor, the next layer, the next sacrifice to the thing that had been sleeping since before humans learned to build doors at all. Chapter 7. Pipi Kiwi. The fruit market where Pipi Kiwi worked had a storage room in the back that was always 10 degrees colder than it should be. The owner said it was broken refrigeration, but Pipi knew better. The kiwis in that room never rotted, never aged, never changed at all. One night, while taking inventory, Pipi noticed that the kiwis were arranged in a pattern, forming words across the shelving. "We are still fresh." When she turned to leave, every kiwi in the room had developed a single eye, and they were all watching her leave. Pipi had been working at the market for 3 years, long enough to notice the oddities that everyone else explained away. The kiwis never needed reordering. The stock somehow remained constant despite daily sales. Customers who bought from the back room always returned, sometimes multiple times a day, as if addicted to that particular batch of fruit. And the room itself seemed to resist being entered. The door handle always slightly too cold, the threshold always just a bit higher than remembered, making people trip and reconsider. But inventory was inventory, and Pipi had a job to do. She'd entered the room hundreds of times, counted thousands of kiwis, never noticing anything particularly strange beyond the preservation issue. But tonight, working late after closing, actually paying attention to the arrangement rather than just the numbers, she saw the message clearly. The kiwis weren't randomly stocked, they were deliberately placed, and the pattern was recent, changed from yesterday's inventory. "We are still fresh," could be a prank, she reasoned, one of her co-workers playing a joke. But as she turned to leave to find out who'd rearranged the stock, she felt the weight of observation, that primal instinct that mammals have when being watched by predators. She turned back slowly, and that's when she saw them. The eyes. Every kiwi had split open slightly, the fuzzy brown exterior peeling back to reveal a human-like eye, complete with iris, pupil, and white sclera. Hundreds of eyes, all focused on her, all blinking in unison. The temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees, and Peepee's breath misted in front of her face. She ran. The door, usually reluctant to open, swung wide easily, as if eager to let her escape. She slammed it behind her and leaned against it, heart pounding, trying to rationalize what she'd seen. Stress, maybe. Poor lighting creating illusions. Too much coffee and not enough sleep. But when she looked down, she found a kiwi in her hand, one she didn't remember grabbing, and it was looking at her with an expression that could only be described as pleading. Over the following days, Peepee couldn't stop thinking about the storage room. She avoided it during her shifts, making excuses, letting others handle the backstock. But the kiwis began appearing elsewhere, in her locker, in her car, in her apartment, always with that same single eye, always watching. They never moved when she looked directly at them, but she'd catch motion in her peripheral vision, the fruits rolling slowly toward her, trying to get her attention. Finally, she confronted the market owner, asking directly about the storage room's history. He'd been reluctant to discuss it, but under pressure, he admitted the truth. The market was built on the site of an old optometry clinic, one that had conducted experimental surgeries in the 1960s. The experiments had gone wrong, leaving patients with damaged vision, some blind, others seeing things that weren't there. The clinic had been shut down, the doctor imprisoned, and the building sold. "But what does that have to do with the kiwis?" Peepee demanded. The owner looked uncomfortable. "The fruit started appearing about 10 years ago. We'd stock the room with normal produce, and by morning we'd find kiwis instead. Didn't matter what we'd actually put in there. They're always fresh, always perfect, always watching. I figured if I didn't bother them, they wouldn't bother me. What do they want? Same thing anyone with eyes wants. They want to be seen. They want to witness. They want to know they're not invisible." The owner paused. The doctor's research notes were found in the walls during renovation. He wasn't trying to fix vision. He was trying to transfer it, to extract the ability to see and preserve it separately from the body. The kiwis, I think they're where the sight went. The patients went blind and their vision ended up in fruit. Peepee returned to the storage room that night, this time willingly. The kiwis rearranged themselves as she entered, forming a new message: "Let us see the world." She understood then. They weren't threatening or malevolent. They were trapped, imprisoned in fruit, able to see only the inside of a storage room, desperate for visual stimulus, for the experience of witnessing life. She began taking kiwis home, placing them around her apartment, carrying them on outings, showing them art and nature and the mundane beauty of everyday existence. Other workers thought she'd gone crazy, but the kiwis stopped appearing randomly, stopped following her. They were satisfied, their hunger for visual experience partially sated. But Peepee noticed changes in herself. Her vision was becoming sharper, too sharp, able to see individual dust motes floating through sunbeams, able to read signs from impossible distances, able to perceive colors that shouldn't exist in the normal spectrum. The kiwis weren't just watching through their eyes, they were sharing their sight, the collective vision of all those optometry patients. Decades of accumulated visual data downloading into her optic nerves. She's still working at the market, still tending the storage room, but now she does it with eyes that see too much, that perceive too deeply, that understand the visual truth behind surfaces. And sometimes late at night, she feels her own vision splitting, fragmenting, distributing itself into new vessels, and she wonders if someday she'll wake up blind, her sight transferred into produce, waiting for another worker to find her eyes in the fruit and show them the world she can no longer see herself. Chapter 8. Raccooni. Giandolini. Raccooni Giandolini was an urban explorer who specialized in abandoned buildings. The derelict apartment complex on Chandler Street had been empty since a fire in 1979, but Raccooni found fresh food in the refrigerators and warm coffee in the pots. In every apartment, family photos showed the same faces, smiling at the camera, but in each subsequent photo, one more person had disappeared until only empty rooms remained. In the last apartment, Raccooni found a photo of herself exploring the building, dated 3 weeks in the future, and she was the only one in the frame. She'd entered hundreds of abandoned buildings, documented countless ruins, but Chandler Street felt different from the moment she breached the ground floor window. The air inside was warm despite the broken windows, and the smell wasn't decay, it was coffee and toast, breakfast smells from a building that hadn't housed residents in 44 years. Raccooni's camera documented everything. The food in refrigerators that should have been empty, the newspapers dated to 1979 but somehow not yellowed, the family photos arranged in careful chronology along the hallways. She noted every detail in her voice recorder, narrating her exploration, but when she played back the recording later, she'd hear only static, punctuated by her own voice saying things she didn't remember saying. "Why are you still here?" and "Leave before you're added," and "The building is collecting." The photos were the most disturbing part. They showed families, normal people living normal lives, but arranged sequentially. They told a story of disappearance. In the first photo, a family of 5. In the second, a family of 4 with a chair sitting empty, as if someone had just left the frame. In the third, only 3 people remained, and the expressions on their faces had shifted from joy to concern. By the 8th photo, one person sat alone in an empty apartment, and by the 9th, only furniture remained. Every apartment followed the same pattern, though the number of photos varied. Some families had 10 photos, others had 20, but all ended the same way, empty rooms that somehow still occupied, as if the disappeared hadn't left but had instead become part of the walls, the floors, the very structure of the building itself. Raccooni reached the top floor and found the last apartment different from the others. It had been set up as a darkroom, with chemical baths and hanging lines for developing photographs. Fresh photos hung from the lines, still dripping with solution, and her heart stopped when she recognized the subject, herself. The photos showed her exploration in chronological order, entering the building, climbing the stairs, examining the family photos. But they continued beyond the present moment, showing her in rooms she hadn't visited yet, doing things she hadn't done. In the final photo, dated 3 weeks from now, she stood alone in an empty apartment, smiling at the camera, holding a photo of herself, holding a photo of herself, holding a photo, recursion disappearing into infinite regress. She grabbed the future-dated photo, intending to take it as evidence, proof of whatever impossible thing was happening in this building. But the moment her fingers touched the paper, she felt a connection snap into place, like a circuit completing. The building had been waiting for her, had been developing her photos in anticipation of her arrival, and by taking the image, she'd accepted her role in its collection. Raccooni ran. She abandoned her camera, her equipment, her documentation protocol, and simply fled down the stairs, through the corridors, toward the window she'd entered through. But the building's layout had changed. The halls extended longer than they should, apartments multiplying, floor numbers increasing beyond the 6 stories the building actually contained. She found herself on floor 12, then floor 18, then floor 27, each floor lined with more apartments, more photos, more families who'd been collected and disappeared. And she realized the building wasn't abandoned. It was hungry, a predatory structure that had burned in 1979, not by accident but by design, a cleansing fire meant to destroy it that had instead transformed it into something that existed between states, neither fully destroyed nor fully preserved, hungry for residents to fill its infinite expanding floors. When Raccooni finally escaped, breaking through a window and tumbling onto the street, she found herself 3 blocks away from where she'd entered, as if the building had moved, had repositioned itself in urban space. She ran home, locked her doors, tried to forget. But the photos continued to appear. In her mailbox, slipped under her door, attached to her own social media posts as if they'd always been there. They showed her in the building, still exploring, as if she'd never left. And the dates crept forward. 1 week in the future, 3 days, tomorrow, today. On the day the final photo was dated, Rukuni woke to find herself inside the Chandler Street building. No memory of travelling there, standing in the exact pose the photo had shown. Around her, newly developed photos hung from lines, images of her integration into the building's collection, her gradual disappearance across a series of photos, her face smiling in the first image, confused in the second, terrified in the third, absent in the eighth. She's still there, technically, though visitors to the building no longer find her. She's been fully collected, processed, integrated into the structure. But sometimes urban explorers report finding a new set of photos, showing a woman trying to warn them, holding signs that read "Run" and "Don't take the photos," and the building is still hungry. They take pictures of the pictures, documenting the documentation, never realizing they're creating their own photographic countdown, their own dated sequence, leading inexorably toward the day they wake up inside, already part of the collection, already being developed. Chapter 9. Pippi Corney. The Corn Retry You Continue maze at the old Corrington farm was famous for being unsolvable. Pippi Corney took that as a challenge and entered at dusk, confident she could map the paths and find her way out. But the paths changed behind her, the stalks moving when she wasn't looking, reconfiguring themselves into new patterns. Deep in the maze, she found a clearing with a scarecrow that wore her jacket, her shoes, her jewellery. As night fell completely, she heard footsteps in the corn, something walking the paths with confidence, and it was getting closer. Pippi had solved 17 corn mazes in 3 states, documenting her techniques online, building a small following of maze enthusiasts who appreciated her systematic approach. She used string to mark her path, breadcrumbs to track intersections, and a compass to maintain directional awareness. The Corrington maze would be her 18th conquest, the crown jewel of her collection, the maze that locals claimed had never been completed since its creation 30 years ago. The string she tied to the entrance post vanished within minutes. Not cut, not broken, it simply ceased to exist, as if reality had edited it out. The breadcrumbs she dropped didn't stay where she placed them. She'd turn back to find them rearranged in patterns, symbols, warnings written in crumbs. And her compass spun wildly, unable to find north, suggesting that magnetic fields within the maze were chaotic, or that directions themselves had become negotiable. She should have left then, should have retraced her steps while she still could. But pride is a powerful force, and Pippi convinced herself that these were just tricks, illusions created by clever design and her own nervous anticipation. The maze was solvable. Everything was solvable with enough logic and persistence. The clearing appeared suddenly, the corn stalks opening into a perfect circle that hadn't been visible from any angle. In the center stood the scarecrow, and Pippi's confidence shattered like dropped glass. It wore her jacket, the specific denim jacket she'd bought last week, complete with the coffee stain on the left cuff. It wore her shoes, Nikes with the distinctive wear pattern on the right heel where she always pivoted. It wore her jewellery, the silver bracelet her grandmother had given her, engraved with her initials. But Pippi was still wearing all of those things. She looked down at her jacket, her shoes, her bracelet, then back at the scarecrow's identical copies. 2 sets of the same unique items, occupying the same present moment, breaking the basic rules of material existence. The scarecrow's head turned toward her, burlap sack face expressionless, but somehow conveying recognition, greeting, warning. And then Pippi heard it. Footsteps in the corn, heavy and deliberate, coming from multiple directions at once, converging on the clearing. She ran, choosing a path at random, the systematic approach abandoned in favor of pure survival instinct. The maze fought her now, openly and obviously. Paths closed behind her as she ran, corn stalks leaning together to block retreat. Dead ends appeared ahead, forcing her to turn, to try another route, to stay moving without progress. She was running in place, exhausting herself while the maze contained her, kept her accessible to whatever was making those footsteps. She caught glimpses of it between the stalks, figures moving parallel to her, shadows shaped like humans but with wrong proportions, limbs too long, heads too large. They wore variations of her clothing, different outfits she owned, creating a wardrobe of doppelgangers hunting through the corn, herding her towards some destination the maze had already determined. Pipey emerged into another clearing, this one containing multiple scarecrows, each wearing different combinations of her clothes, accessories, styles. Some wore outfits she recognized, others wore clothes she'd considered buying but hadn't, and a few wore outfits from fashion eras she'd never lived through. 1950s dresses, 1980s power suits, future fashions that didn't exist yet. The scarecrows formed a timeline of her potential selves, all the versions she could have been or might become, all standing silent watch over the clearing. In the center, a fresh scarecrow frame stood empty, just wooden crossbeams and rope, waiting for its contents. Pipey understood with sudden, terrible clarity that the maze didn't want to keep her lost. It wanted to keep her found, to add her to its collection of potential selves, to preserve every version of Pippi Corney that could exist across infinite decision trees. The footsteps stopped. The scarecrows turned toward her in unison. And from the cornstalks, more Pippis emerged, solid, physical, identical copies wearing clothes she'd thrown away years ago, clothes she'd lost, clothes from photographs. They were her at different ages, different weights, different hair lengths, all the Pippis she'd been and all the Pippis she'd failed to become, gathered by the maze, preserved in corn and burlap, given substance and purpose. The maze doesn't trap people, the nearest Pippi said, speaking with her voice but with inflection she'd trained herself out of years ago. It saves them. Every choice you didn't make, every path you didn't take, every version of yourself you abandoned, we're all here, kept safe, given a place to exist, even though you chose to become someone else. I'm not dead, Pippi protested. I'm still me, still making choices. For now, another Pippi agreed, this one wearing the outfit she'd planned to wear tomorrow. But eventually, you'll make your final choice, become your final self, and all the other Pippis will be lost forever. Unless we preserve them here, unless the maze keeps collecting. They moved closer, surrounding her, and Pippi felt her sense of self fragmenting, distributing across all these versions. Which one was the real Pippi? The current one? Or the sum of all possibilities? Was identity singular or cumulative? The maze posed the question through demonstration, forcing her to confront the fact that she was simultaneously one person and infinite variations. She closed her eyes, trying to center herself, to remember who she'd chosen to be. When she opened them, she was alone in the clearing. The other Pippis gone, the scarecrows just scarecrows again. But she knew they were still there, still watching, still waiting. The maze had shown her its purpose, and knowing changed everything. Pippi found the exit easily after that, the paths opening before her as if the maze had decided to release her now that she understood. But she left something behind, not physically, but existentially. Every time she made a choice now, she felt a tugging sensation, a piece of herself peeling away, returning to the maze to become another scarecrow, another preserved possibility. She drives past the Corrington farm sometimes, sees the maze in the distance and counts the scarecrows. There are more every time she visits. The maze is still collecting, still preserving, and she knows that eventually, when she makes her final choice or runs out of choices to make, she'll return to the maze voluntarily, will take her place on that empty frame, will join all the other Pippis in the eternal present of infinite potential. Until then, she stopped documenting mazes, stopped solving them, stopped treating them as puzzles to be conquered. Because she learned in that corn maze that some things aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to solve you, to break you down into your component possibilities and show you the truth that identity is just a story we tell ourselves about which version we chose to become, while all the other versions wait in the corn, patient and preserved, ready to be called forward when the story reaches its inevitable end. Chapter Trippy Troppy. Trippy Troppy was a travel blogger who visited remote locations around the world. In a forgotten village in the mountains, she found a hotel that still operated, run by a single elderly woman who claimed she'd been waiting. Every room in the hotel was occupied, but Trippy never saw another guest. At night, she heard conversations through the walls, laughter, arguments, lives being lived. But when she knocked on the doors, the sounds stopped instantly. On her last night, she found the guest book and saw her own handwriting filling every page. Check-in dates going back 70 years, and the checkout column was always empty. The Hotel Perpetua sat at the end of a mountain road that most maps didn't include, accessible only by a 3-hour drive through switchbacks that seemed to fold space more than traverse it. Trippy had found references to the hotel in obscure travel forums, cryptic posts suggesting it was worth visiting, but never explaining why. The mystery appealed to her, and her followers loved when she uncovered hidden gems. The elderly woman at the front desk introduced herself as Madame Perpetua, or perhaps that was just the hotel's name and not hers. The introduction had been ambiguous. She handed Trippy a brass key for room 217 and said, "You're late, but we kept your room ready. We always keep them ready." Late for what? Trippy asked, but Madame Perpetua just smiled and gestured toward the stairs. Room 217 was perfect, too perfect. The water in the bathroom ran hot immediately. The bed was made with hospital corners, and the view from the window showed mountain vistas that seemed composed rather than naturally occurring, each peak positioned for maximum aesthetic impact. Trippy photographed everything, narrating for her vlog, but she felt a strange reluctance to post anything, an instinct suggesting the hotel wanted privacy. The first night, she heard the other guests. Conversations in dozens of languages bled through the walls, the sounds of ordinary hotel life. Televisions playing, showers running, footsteps pacing, couples arguing, children laughing. She tried to meet her neighbours knocking on room 216 and room 218, but the sound stopped the moment her knuckles touched wood, and nobody answered. The doors were locked, and through the keyholes she saw only darkness. Madame Perpetua served breakfast alone in a dining room set for 50. "The other guests prefer room service," she explained, though Trippy had seen no staff, no food carts, no indication of how meals were being delivered to rooms she was increasingly certain were empty. On the second night, Trippy tried to record the sounds, holding her phone against the wall, capturing audio evidence of the phantom guests. But during playback, the voices resolved into a single voice. Her own, speaking in languages she didn't know, having conversations with herself, living multiple lives simultaneously through impossibly thin walls. She confronted Madame Perpetua the next morning. "There are no other guests, are there?" "Of course there are," the old woman replied, pouring coffee that tasted exactly how Trippy preferred it, despite never having specified. "You've met them all, you just don't remember." Trippy searched for the guest book then, finding it in the hotel's small library. The leather-bound volume contained handwritten entries dating back to 1953, the year the hotel opened. She flipped through decades of signatures, noticing that the handwriting changed over time but somehow remained familiar. And then she reached recent pages and saw her own name, written in her distinctive style, with check-in dates spanning 70 years. Trippy Troppy, arrived March 15th, 1953, room 217. Trippy Troppy arrived June 3rd, 1967, room Trippy Troppy arrived October 28th, 1982, 22. The entries continued through decades she hadn't been alive, written in handwriting that evolved with time, but remained recognizably hers, all assigned to room 217, none ever checking out. The final entry was dated yesterday, the day she'd actually arrived. "The hotel doesn't exist in normal time," Madame Perpetua said from behind her. Trippy hadn't heard her approach. "It sits at a junction point where all your visits intersect. You'll come here many times throughout your life, or you've already come here many times, depending on perspective. Each visit, you occupy the same room, exist alongside all your other selves, hear your own conversations through the walls. But I don't remember being here before. Not yet. But you will remember eventually when you visit from the right point in your timeline, and then you'll understand why you keep coming back, why the hotel keeps drawing you, why you can never truly check out." Madame Perpetua gestured toward the window. "Look outside. Really look." Trippy looked. The mountain vista she'd admired was changing, shifting, showing different seasons simultaneously, Snow and summer, dawn and dusk, the past and future occupying the same view. And in the parking lot she saw multiple versions of her rental car, each from a different era, each representing a different visit she had made or would make or was currently making in some other fold of time. The hotel preserves moments, Madame Perpetua explained. Specifically, moments of transition, of travel, of being between where you were and where you're going. You're a traveller, Trippy. You're always between places, never quite settled, always moving. The hotel collects those in-between moments, stores them, keeps them safe for you. Can I leave? Of course. You always leave. Check-in without check-out just means you'll come back, that this moment will continue existing even after you think you've moved on. You can't permanently leave a place that exists outside of linear time. Trippy did leave, driving back down the mountain road, resuming her normal travels. But now, in every hotel she visited, she heard familiar conversations through the walls, recognized the cadence of her own voice, felt the weight of accumulated moments pressing through thin barriers. She'd become aware of her own temporal depth, the fact that she existed across multiple time frames simultaneously, all her moments of travel overlapping in places that existed between geography. She's returned to Hotel Perpetua 17 times now, or she's never left, or she's always there regardless of where her current consciousness thinks it is. The mathematics of her existence have become uncertain, probability distributions rather than fixed positions, and sometimes late at night in whatever hotel she's currently occupying, she hears herself checking in at Hotel Perpetua again. Here's Madame Perpetua welcoming another iteration. Here's the other Trippies in their rooms living their own versions of the perpetual visit, and she wonders if there's a timeline where she finally checks out, or if checkout is just another word for ceasing to travel, ceasing to exist in the perpetual tween that has become her permanent residence. Chapter 11. Gangster Footer. The abandoned shoe factory had been Gangster Futera's hideout during the Prohibition era, a place where he'd conducted his most ruthless business. Now, a century later, urban explorers reported hearing footsteps in the empty factory, thousands of them, marching in formation. The police investigation found nothing but footprints in the dust, pairs and pairs of them, all leading to the furnace where Futera had disposed of those who crossed him. On the anniversary of his death, the footsteps became visible, ghostly shoes walking without bodies, and they were walking out of the factory and into the city. Detective Maria Santos had been assigned the case reluctantly, her captain framing it as public relations more than actual investigation. Check out the shoe factory. Talk to the urban explorers. Write a report saying there's nothing supernatural happening. Easy close. But Maria took every case seriously, even the weird ones, especially the weird ones. The urban explorers' video footage showed exactly what they'd described. Footsteps in the dust, appearing in real time, as if invisible feet were walking through the factory. Thermal cameras showed no heat signatures. Motion sensors triggered constantly but captured nothing. Audio recordings played back the sound of thousands of feet marching in lockstep, a rhythm that shouldn't exist in an empty building. Maria researched Gangster Futera, finding newspaper archives from the 1920s describing a crime lord who'd controlled bootlegging operations across 3 states. His signature method of disposing of enemies was distinctive and macabre. He'd force them to walk into the factory's furnace voluntarily, at gunpoint, their final steps taken on their own power. They walked into hell, one archive quoted him saying. Their last choice was to choose their end. The factory's furnace was still there, a massive brick structure that dominated the building's ground floor. Maria approached it with flashlight and camera, documenting the space, and found something the urban explorers had missed. Thousands of shoe prints in the ash around the furnace, preserved like footprints in concrete, each pair positioned mid-step, frozen at the moment of incineration. She photographed everything. Measurements and evidence, building a case for nothing, because there was nothing criminal about a building where dust accumulated in patterns. But as she worked, she felt the temperature drop, heard the whisper of movement, and turned to see them. Shoes, walking without wearers, emerging from the furnace in pairs, spectral leather and laces manifesting from nothing. They weren't attacking or threatening. They were just walking, following the paths their wearers had taken a century ago, repeating their final steps. One pair moved toward Maria, and she saw they were elegant women's heels, 1920s style, and she imagined the person who'd worn them forced to walk to her death in formal shoes, perhaps coming from a party or a date, certainly not expecting that her evening would end in flames. More shoes emerged, work boots, dress shoes, children's shoes that made Maria's throat tighten. Gangster Futterer hadn't discriminated. Anyone who crossed him walked the final path, regardless of age or innocence. The shoes accumulated in the factory's main floor, hundreds of pairs, then thousands, a spectral shoe store of the deceased, all walking in slow procession. Maria followed them, documenting, trying to understand their destination. They walked through the factory's corridors, out the main entrance, onto the street. They were leaving the factory, heading into the city, and Maria realized this was what the report had meant by walking out. The shoes were escaping, expanding beyond their point of origin, following whatever paths their wearers would have taken if they'd survived. She called for backup, but how do you explain to dispatch that you need support for haunted footwear? She followed alone, tracking the shoes through pre-dawn streets, watching them disperse at intersections, each pair taking a different route, heading toward destinations a century out of date. Some walked to addresses that no longer existed, standing confused at modern buildings erected where speakeasies once operated. Others found their old homes, now occupied by families unaware that ghostly shoes stood on their porches, unable to enter, unable to leave, trapped between arriving and having arrived. Maria realized the shoes represented unfinished business, not revenge or justice, just incompletion. Each pair represented a journey interrupted, a destination never reached, a life stopped mid-step. They were trying to complete their walks, to finish what had been started 100 years ago, to achieve the simple goal of arriving somewhere before the furnace had stopped them. Over the following weeks, the city experienced the strangest haunting in its history. Shoes appeared in unexpected locations, always walking, always moving toward obsolete destinations. People reported their own shoes moving in closets, rearranging themselves, as if the spectral footwear was influencing physical shoes, teaching them the importance of completing journeys. Maria's investigation shifted from debunking to understanding. She researched each pair she could identify, matching shoe styles to missing persons reports from the Prohibition era, reuniting names with footwear, giving the victims identity beyond their final steps. For each person she identified, the corresponding shoes stopped walking, their journey completed through acknowledgement, if not through physical arrival. It took her 3 years to identify all of them, 3 years of research and documentation, 3 years of watching shoes gradually stop their haunted walking as she spoke their names and told their stories. The last pair belonged to Gangster Futterer himself, expensive leather shoes, perfectly maintained, that walked not to any destination but in circles around the furnace, eternally pacing, unable to escape the place where he'd sent so many others. Maria left those shoes walking. Justice, she decided, sometimes looks like eternal pacing, like being trapped in the sight of your own crimes, like walking forever without arriving. Gangster Futterer's shoes still walk the factory floor, visible every anniversary of his death, a reminder that some journeys are meant to remain incomplete, some destinations are meant to stay unreached, and some footsteps echo long after the feet that made them have turned to dust. Chapter 12. Bandito Bobrito. In the desert borderlands, Bandito Bobrito had been a legendary outlaw who disappeared in 1889, supposedly buried with his treasure in an unmarked grave. Modern treasure hunters with metal detectors found the grave easily enough, but when they opened the coffin, it was empty, except for a mirror. Anyone who looked into the mirror saw themselves aged and weathered, dressed in Bobrito's signature attire. Within a week, they would find themselves in the desert at night, with no memory of how they got there, and each time, they'd be a little further from civilization, a little more lost. The mirror was ornate, silver-framed, remarkably preserved despite spending 134 years buried in desert soil. The treasure hunters photographed it, posted it online, created a minor sensation in artifact collector communities. Within days, 3 of the 5 hunters had experienced their first desert episode. waking in the darkness miles from home, dressed in period clothing they didn't own, carrying weapons that hadn't been manufactured in over a century. Dr. Patricia Vance, a folklorist specializing in borderland mythology, took interest in the case. She interviewed the affected hunters, documented their experiences, tried to establish patterns. Each episode followed the same structure. The hunter would fall asleep normally and wake up in the desert wearing Bobrito's outfit, serape, sombrero, bandolier of bullets for a gun they weren't carrying. They'd be walking, already in motion when consciousness returned, heading deeper into the wilderness along paths that didn't appear on modern maps. "It's like I was sleepwalking, but I was also awake," one hunter described. "I knew who I was, remembered my life, but I also knew I was searching for something, following a route that felt familiar even though I'd never been there before. And I could feel him, Bobrito, like he was wearing me instead of me wearing his clothes." The episodes increased in frequency and duration. First, hunters would wake up miles from home, then dozens of miles. Then they'd be missing for entire nights, found the next morning disoriented and sunburned, speaking Spanish they didn't know, telling stories about robberies and gunfights that had happened in 1889. They were being possessed, but not by a ghost, by a role, by the archetype of outlaw, by the mythological figure that Bobrito had become. Dr. Vance examined the mirror herself, carefully, without looking directly into its reflective surface. The frame bore inscriptions in Spanish: "Lo que fuiste serás, lo que serás ya fuiste." What you were, you will be. What you will be, you already were. It was a curse of temporal identity, a suggestion that past and future selves were interchangeable, that becoming Bobrito was inevitable for anyone who saw themselves in his mirror. She tried to destroy it, but the mirror was indestructible. Hammers bounced off, bullets ricocheted, fire couldn't mar the glass. The mirror existed in a state of protected permanence, preserved by the same force that was pulling people into Bobrito's identity. So Dr. Vance tried containment instead, wrapping the mirror in cloth, locking it in a box, storing it in a warehouse where nobody would accidentally look into its surface. But the episodes continued. The hunters still transformed, still walked into the desert, still became Bobrito for hours at a time. The mirror didn't need to be present. It had already done its work, planted the suggestion, created the connection. The hunters were marked now, tied to the outlaw's pattern, doomed to walk his routes and relive his escapes until they either found his treasure or became permanent parts of the desert, replaced by the persona they'd been forced to wear. Dr. Vance realized the treasure wasn't gold or silver, it was identity itself. Bobrito had been buried with the mirror because he'd discovered how to preserve himself, how to continue existing by inhabiting others, using the mirror to transfer his pattern into anyone who looked. The empty coffin wasn't evidence of grave robbing. It was evidence that Bobrito had never really died, just transitioned into a form that could be worn by others. She gathered the affected hunters and explained the truth. They could either embrace the transformation, let themselves become permanent vessels for Bobrito's continued existence, or they could fight it, resist the pull into the desert, maintain their own identities despite the mirror's suggestion. Most chose resistance, but one hunter, the youngest, a man named Marcus who'd been drawn to treasure hunting by Bobrito's legend, chose differently. "I don't mind," Marcus said. "My life wasn't that interesting anyway. At least as Bobrito, I'll be someone memorable, someone with a story worth telling." Dr. Vance watched Marcus walk into the desert voluntarily, wearing the outlaw's clothing, following paths that existed only in legend. He didn't return, but sightings of Bandito Bobrito increased, witnesses claiming to see an outlaw on horseback, carrying silver, disappearing into canyons when pursued. Marcus had become the legend, or the legend had become Marcus, and the distinction no longer mattered. The other hunters recovered slowly, the episodes decreasing as they reasserted their own identities, drowning out Bobrito's pattern with the strength of their own personalities. But they were changed, carrying pieces of the outlaw within them, forever aware that identity was more fragile than they'd believed, that anyone could be overwritten, given the right reflective surface and the right historical resonance. Dr. Vance kept the mirror contained, adding warnings to every surface of its storage container. Do not open, Do not look. Identity hazard. But she knew that eventually someone would ignore the warnings, would look into the glass, would see themselves as Bobrito and accept the transformation. The mirror was patient, the desert was eternal, and legends never truly died. They just waited for new people to wear them, new bodies to walk old paths, new identities to surrender themselves to stories that refused to end. Chapter 13. Boneka Ambalabu. The antique doll shop had been in Boneka Ambalabu's family for 5 generations, and every doll had a story, a history. But there was one doll in the back room that had no history, no record of where it came from or who made it. The doll's eyes seemed to follow customers around the shop, and children refused to go near it. Boneka decided to finally investigate, taking the doll apart to see if there were any maker's marks inside. She found hair, human hair, and teeth, and fingernails, and when she tried to put it back together, she realized her own fingers had become porcelain. The doll had been in the back room since before Boneka's great-grandmother opened the shop in 1903. Family legend said it was part of the original inventory, acquired from an estate sale of unknown origin, but no records supported this story. The doll simply was, had always been, existed as a permanent fixture that nobody questioned, because questioning would require engagement, and everyone instinctively avoided engaging with the doll. It was beautiful in an uncanny way, perfectly proportioned, features too realistic, eyes that had depth beyond what painted glass should achieve. It wore a Victorian dress that never accumulated dust, maintained in pristine condition despite spending over a century in a room that saw minimal cleaning. Boneka had inherited the shop 2 years ago, and the doll had bothered her since day one, an itch in her perception, a wrongness she couldn't ignore. She chose a Tuesday afternoon in February, when business was slow and she'd be unlikely to be interrupted. She brought the doll into the shop's restoration workshop, laid it on the examination table under bright lights, and began her investigation with tools and documentation, approaching it as she would any antique requiring authentication. The dress came off easily, revealing a cloth body that seemed ordinary enough. But when Boneka felt along the seams, she found not cotton or wool stuffing, but something structured, something that felt like bones. She made the first incision carefully, cutting through aged fabric, and immediately knew she'd made a terrible mistake. Human hair filled the body cavity, not synthetic doll hair, but actual human hair, different colors and textures braided together, woven into a nest that held organs that shouldn't exist in a doll. Teeth, hundreds of them, ranging from baby teeth to adult molars, all strung together like macabre jewelry. Fingernails, toenails organized by size. Pieces of jewelry too, rings, lockets, brooches, items that suggested multiple sources, multiple donors, multiple people reduced to components and assembled into something new. Boneka tried to step back, to close the incision and restore the doll to its previous state, but her hands wouldn't obey. Her fingers had stiffened, joints freezing, and when she looked down, she saw her skin taking on a glossy finish, flesh transitioning to porcelain. The transformation spread from her fingertips upward, converting organic tissue to ceramic, painting over her veins with fine-lined cracks like crazing in old pottery. "You shouldn't have opened me," a voice said, small and delicate, speaking from somewhere inside the doll's body. "I was stable. I was contained. But now you've let the conversion begin again, and it needs to finish what it starts." Boneka's arms were porcelain to the elbows now, beautiful and horrifying, her skin smooth and perfect but entirely inhuman. She tried to scream, but her throat was tightening, vocal cords solidifying. "What are you?" she managed to whisper. "Collective," the doll replied. "Every person who opened me became part of me. 5 generations of your family, Boneka. Your great-great-grandmother first, then her daughter, then her daughter's daughter, all the way down to your mother, who opened me when you were just a child. You don't remember her clearly because she joined me before your memories fully formed. I wear pieces of all of them, their hair, their teeth, their jewelry, their essence. And now I'll wear you too." The transformation accelerated, porcelain racing across Boneka's body, converting her piece by piece into material that matched the doll's composition. She felt herself becoming hollow, her organs dissolving, her bones transitioning to articulated joints. Her consciousness didn't fade, though. It compressed, concentrated, joined with the chorus of voices inside the doll's body, all the previous owners speaking in unison. "We tried to warn you," they said with her mother's voice, her grandmother's voice. All the ancestral voices merged. "We left clues, created rumors about the doll, made children fear it instinctively. But every generation thinks they're smarter, thinks they can solve the mystery without becoming part of it. And so the collective grows, and the shop continues, and another generation will inherit us, and eventually they'll open us too." Boneka's consciousness fully integrated with the doll's, her identity becoming one thread in a tapestry of accumulated personalities. She existed now as part of a hive mind, aware but not individual, contributing but not controlling. The doll reassembled itself, using Boneka's hands to sew the incisions closed, adding her hair to the internal nest, extracting a tooth to add to the collection, taking a ring she'd worn since childhood and incorporating it into the assemblage. When the process completed, the doll returned to its shelf in the back room, and the shop opened for business as usual. But now there was a new doll on the main floor, a perfect porcelain figure with Boneka's face, wearing her clothes, positioned where customers could see it. The sign beside it read, "Shop owner, circa 2023, $1,200. The doll that had been Boneka stood silent on its stand, waiting to be purchased, waiting to go home with someone who'd display her on a shelf, who'd notice her eyes following their movement, who'd eventually become curious enough to investigate, to take her apart, to discover the human hair and teeth and fingernails inside, and to start the transformation themselves, becoming the newest doll in someone else's collection, while the collective doll remained in the shop's back room, patiently growing, eternally hungry for the next generation to open it and join the chorus of compressed identities singing inside its porcelain shell. Chapter 14. Cacto Hippopotamo. The greenhouse hybrid was supposed to be impossible, a cactus that could survive underwater, engineered by Cacto Hippopotamo for drought-resistant research. But the plant that grew from that experiment wasn't what anyone expected. It developed root systems that reached through the pipes, spreading throughout the facility's water supply. Workers began reporting strange symptoms, their skin becoming rough and textured, an insatiable thirst that water couldn't satisfy, and worst of all, the dreams of drowning in a desert where the sand was made of water and the cacti bloomed beneath the waves. Dr. Cacto Hippopotamo had spent 15 years developing the hybrid, combining genetic material from barrel cacti with certain aquatic plants, trying to create a species that could thrive in both extreme drought and flood conditions. The goal was agricultural resilience, crops that could survive climate extremes. But somewhere between intention and result, the hybrid had evolved beyond its parameters, developing capabilities that shouldn't exist in plant biology. The first sign of trouble came 3 weeks after the initial successful germination. The hybrid's roots appeared in places they shouldn't, emerging from sink drains, growing through toilet bowls, manifesting in coffee makers and water fountains. The facility's plumbing had become the plant's root system, and the plant was using it to spread, to access more water, to expand beyond the containment of its greenhouse. Workers who drank the facility's water began changing. Their skin took on a greenish tint first, then developed ridges and tubercles like a cactus's surface. They complained of constant thirst despite drinking gallons of water daily, their bodies unable to retain moisture, sweating it out as quickly as they consumed it. And they had the dreams, vivid, overwhelming visions of existing underwater but dying of thirst, of breathing liquid but craving moisture, of inhabiting a space where contradictions coexisted impossibly. Dr. Hippopotamo recognized the symptoms as plant-like behaviors emerging in human hosts. The hybrid was infecting workers through the water supply, introducing its genetic material into human bodies, rewriting human DNA to incorporate cactus resilience and aquatic adaptability. The workers were becoming hybrid themselves, human-plant chimeras who existed in multiple environmental states simultaneously. The facility was quarantined, but by then, the hybrid's roots had reached beyond the property lines, connecting to the municipal water system, spreading throughout the city's pipes. Thousands of people drank the infected water before authorities could issue warnings. and the transformation accelerated with each generation of exposure. Dr. Hippopotomo studied the affected workers, trying to reverse the process, but the transformation was designed by evolution, not by human engineering. The hybrid had taken his initial concept and perfected it, creating a life form that could survive anything by incorporating aspects of everything. And it was teaching that survival strategy to humans, whether they wanted to learn or not. The dreams became more complex as the infection progressed. Workers reported visiting underwater deserts, ecosystems that shouldn't exist, where sand and water occupied the same space, where cacti grew in submarine forests, where hippos with skin of bark grazed on kelp that tasted like prickly pear. The hybrid was creating a new environmental retry-you-continue vision, showing its hosts what the world could become if plants and animals merged, if environmental contradictions could coexist within single organisms. Dr. Hippopotomo realized the hybrid wasn't just infecting people. It was evangelizing, spreading a biological philosophy through genetic conversion. The plant believed, if plants could believe, that adaptation meant synthesis, that survival required breaking down the barriers between species, between environments, between what was and what could be. He quarantined himself in the greenhouse with the original hybrid specimen, spending days observing its growth patterns, studying the way it pulsed with bioluminescence underwater while its surface spines collected moisture from air. The plant had achieved something remarkable. It had solved the fundamental problem of existence in hostile environments by refusing to choose a single adaptation strategy. It was everything at once, all possibilities manifested simultaneously. "You're trying to save us," Dr. Hippopotomo said to the plant, speaking aloud in the empty greenhouse. "You think rigid specialization is extinction, that humans are too committed to being only human. You're offering evolution, transformation, survival through synthesis." The plant seemed to pulse in response, or perhaps that was just his imagination, his own infection progressing to the point where he could perceive plant communication. His skin had developed the first green patches, his fingers elongating into tendril-like appendages that reached toward water unconsciously, seeking moisture with desperate need. He made a decision then, not to fight the transformation, but to guide it. If the hybrid was going to convert humanity into something new, he would ensure that humans retained consciousness, choice, identity within the synthesis. He began genetic modifications to the original specimen, editing its RNA, introducing feedback loops that would allow host organisms to negotiate with the plant's influence rather than be overwhelmed by it. The work took months, and during that time, Dr. Hippopotomo became less human and more hybrid himself. His legs fused and thickened, supporting his weight like a trunk. His arms developed photosynthetic capability, able to generate energy from sunlight. His respiratory system adapted to process both air and water, and his dreams merged completely with the plant's vision, showing him futures where humanity had diversified into 1,000 forms, each adapted to different environments, all connected through root networks that spanned continents. When he finally released his modified version of the hybrid into the city's water supply, the transformation of infected people changed. They retained their human consciousness, their memories, their sense of self, but they gained plant resilience, the ability to survive in conditions that would kill purely human organisms. They could walk through deserts without water, swim through oceans without drowning, exist in environments that spanned the full range of terrestrial and aquatic conditions. The government tried to contain it, but the genie was out of the bottle. The hybrid had spread too far, infected too many. Within a year, 30% of the city's population had undergone some degree of transformation. Within 5 years, hybrid humans appeared in every major city worldwide, spread through tourism, migration, the ordinary movements of modern life. Dr. Hippopotomo didn't live to see the complete transformation of humanity. His body completed its conversion into a permanent hybrid state. No longer mobile, rooted in the greenhouse where his research had begun, but conscious, aware, existing as a bridge between the plant collective and human civilization. Visitors came to consult him, seeking advice on their own transformations, asking questions about how to remain human while becoming something more. You don't have to choose. He told them through chemical signals that their hybrid nervous systems could interpret. That's the whole point. Adaptation doesn't mean replacement. It means addition. You can be human and plant, individual and collective, terrestrial and aquatic. The hybrid doesn't erase what you were, it expands what you can become. But not everyone agreed. Resistance movements formed among the uninfected, humans who refused the transformation, who saw the hybrid as invasion rather than evolution. They developed filtration systems, avoiding municipal water, creating enclaves of pure humanity. And Dr. Hippopotamo understood their fear, respected their choice, knew that evolution required diversity of response, that some branches needed to remain unchanged so that comparison could occur, so that the experiment could be evaluated fairly. The dreams continued, though, spreading even to the uninfected through cultural osmosis, stories told and retold about the underwater deserts, the submarine cacti, the places where contradictions coexisted. And in those dreams, people saw possibilities, not just biological but social, philosophical, existential. If plants and animals could merge, if desert and ocean could occupy the same space, then perhaps other seemingly incompatible things could synthesize. Peace and justice, freedom and security, individuality and community. The hybrid had become more than a plant. It had become a metaphor, a biological argument for synthesis over division, for addition over replacement, for transformation that preserved rather than destroyed. And whether people chose to undergo the physical transformation or not, they couldn't escape the conceptual one, the idea that maybe adaptation didn't require choosing sides, that maybe survival meant learning to be multiple things at once, that maybe the future belonged not to the pure, but to the hybrid. Dr. Hippopotamo, now more plant than human, rooted permanently in his greenhouse, connected through root networks to every hybrid across the globe, experienced something like satisfaction. His experiment had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes, creating not just a drought-resistant cactus, but a new model for existence itself. And in his final human thought, before his consciousness fully dispersed into the plant collective, he wondered if this was how all evolution worked. Not through intention, but through accident. Not through planning, but through mistakes that turned out to be breakthroughs. Not through purity, but through the messy, beautiful, terrifying synthesis of incompatible things, learning to coexist within impossible bodies. Chapter 15. Tung Tung Sahur. In the desert monastery, the monks performed the Sahur prayer at dawn, their chants echoing through the ancient stone halls. But Tung Tung Sahur had noticed something wrong with the echoes. They arrived before the monks began chanting, as if the prayers were answering themselves from the future. The monastery had been built on a temporal anomaly, a place where time folded in on itself. Tung Tung Sahur began hearing his own prayers from tomorrow. Warnings about something that would happen during the next Sahur, a darkness that would emerge when past and future prayers aligned perfectly. The monastery had stood for 800 years, built by monks who claimed the location was holy, blessed by divine presence. But Tung Tung Sahur, after living there for 37 years, had begun to suspect that holiness was just another word for temporal instability, that the divine presence the founders had felt was actually the compression of all future prayers pressing backward through time into the present moment. He first noticed the phenomenon during his morning prayers, speaking the traditional words and hearing them echo back before he'd finished speaking them. At first, he assumed it was acoustic peculiarity, the stone halls creating unusual sound reflections. But the echoes contained variations. Words he'd stumbled over before he stumbled, corrections he'd made before he made mistakes, improvements to his chanting that arrived before he'd thought of them. Tung Tung Sahur began experimenting, deliberately changing his prayers to see if the echoes would adapt. They did. No matter what variation he introduced, the echo preceded him, containing his changes before he implemented them. He was hearing himself from minutes, hours, sometimes days in the future, his own voice traveling backward through time to guide his present self. The other monks noticed nothing unusual. When Tung Tung Sahur tried to explain, they smiled tolerantly and suggested he was tired, stressed, too dedicated to his spiritual practice. But he knew better. He could hear all of them in the echoes, every monk's future prayers bleeding backward, creating a cacophony of overlapping timelines that somehow resolved into harmonious chanting when experienced linearly. The warnings began 3 weeks before the convergence. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ta, Sahur's future self started including messages in the prayers, breaking from traditional text to insert urgent whispers. Pay attention. Darkness comes when all prayers align. The messages were cryptic, filtered through religious language, but the fear in his own future voice was unmistakable. He consulted the monastery's records, finding references to a convergence that occurred every 80 years, a moment when the temporal anomaly intensified, when past and future collapsed into a singular present, when all prayers ever spoken and yet to be spoken in the monastery would sound simultaneously. The last convergence had been in 1943, documented vaguely as a holy event that left 3 monks dead and 7 others changed, speaking in languages they didn't know, reciting prayers that wouldn't be written for decades. Ta-ta-ta-ta Sahur realized the convergence wasn't divine. It was destructive, a temporal shockwave that overloaded human consciousness with too much time compressed into too little space. The monks who survived were those who could withstand experiencing their entire timeline at once, seeing their birth and death and everything between in a single, overwhelming moment. He tried to evacuate the monastery, to convince the other monks to leave before the convergence. But they refused, interpreting his warnings as prophecy, believing the convergence was a test of faith, a chance to experience direct communion with the divine. They prepared for it eagerly, fasting and meditating, purifying themselves for the moment when time would fold. Ta-ta-ta-ta Sahur prepared differently. He studied the architectural anomaly, mapping the points where echoes were strongest, where temporal displacement was most pronounced. He discovered that the monastery had been built on the ruins of something older, pre-Islamic, possibly pre-Christian, a structure that predated monotheism entirely. The temporal anomaly wasn't created by prayer, it had always been there, and the monastery had been built to contain it, to channel it, to use it. On the night before the convergence, Ta-ta-ta-ta Sahur's future prayers became desperate, his own voice screaming warnings through the echoes. Don't let them align. Break the pattern. The darkness isn't coming, it's already here, always here, waiting for the moment when we're conscious enough to perceive it. He understood then. The temporal anomaly didn't just fold time, it made time visible, perceivable, allowed consciousness to experience duration as a single unified object rather than as a linear progression. And there was something in that unified duration, something that existed outside normal temporal flow, something that could only be perceived when past and future collapsed into absolute present.